This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. The day started off normal enough. I woke up early, dragged all the stuff out onto the lawn, and set up some folding tables. Nothing fancy, just your typical suburban yard sale. Old books, kitchen gadgets I never used, some clothes that didn't fit anymore, that kind of thing. People started trickling in around 9 a.m. The usual crowd, bargain hunters, bored neighbors, families out for a stroll. I was actually having a pretty good time, chatting with folks and haggling over prices. It felt good to declutter and make a few bucks in the process. But then I noticed him. This guy in a Dodgers cap, probably in his 40s, hanging around the periphery of the sale. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just shy or taking his time browsing. But after a while I realized he kept circling back to the same spots, picking up items and putting them down without ever buying anything. And he was watching me. Not in a casual way, but intensely staring when he thought I wasn't looking. It made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, told myself I was being paranoid. But as the morning wore on and other customers came and went, he remained, always lurking, always watching. By early afternoon, the crowd had thinned out considerably. Just a couple stragglers left, and him. I started packing up, eager to get inside and away from his unsettling presence. That's when things took a terrifying turn. As I was folding up one of the card tables, I saw him approaching out of the corner of my eye. My heart started racing. I turned to face him, trying to stay calm. "Sorry, I'm actually closing up now," I said, forcing a smile. "But if there's something specific you're interested in, I can—" I broke off as I saw the look in his eyes. Cold, predatory. My blood ran cold as I realized just how alone and exposed I was out here. "I'm not interested in your junk," he said in a low voice. "I'm interested in you." Before I could react, he grabbed a hammer off one of the tables and lunged at me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, knocking over a box of books. My mind was reeling in panic. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in my own front yard in broad daylight. Pure survival instinct took over. As he swung the hammer at my head, I ducked and frantically grabbed for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around a heavy wrench. I swung it wildly, connecting with his shoulder. He grunted in pain and faltered for a split second. It was all the opening I needed. I ran for the house as fast as I could, his footsteps pounding behind me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then raced through the house, making sure every entrance was secured. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I babbled hysterically to the operator, convinced he was going to break down the door at any moment. The police arrived within minutes, but he was already gone. They took my statement and searched the area, but found no sign of him, just the scattered remnants of my yard sale, now a crime scene. The rest of that day passed in a blur of police questions and crime scene texts. My neighbors gathered to gawk and gossip. I felt numb, like I was watching it all happen to someone else. It's been weeks now, and I still jump at every sound. I've installed security cameras and alarms. I don't go anywhere alone. But the worst part is not knowing. Not knowing who he was or why he targeted me. Not knowing if he'll come back to finish what he started. Every time I see someone in a Dodgers cap, my heart stops. Every car that drives by too slowly sends me into a panic. I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, watching and waiting. The police say they're doing everything they can, but I know the trail has gone cold. He could be anywhere. He could be anyone. I keep replaying that moment in my mind. The look in his eyes as he came at me with that hammer, the sickening thud as the wrench connected with his body, the terror of thinking I was about to die on my own front lawn. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my mind conjured up this boogeyman out of some deep-seated fear or trauma. But then I see the dent in the wrench, the police report sitting on my coffee table, the constant gnawing fear that has become my new normal. I don't do yard sales anymore. I barely leave the house at all. My garage is still full of junk, a reminder of how quickly life can change, how a perfectly ordinary day can suddenly become a waking nightmare. I know I should try to move on, to not let fear control my life. But every time I start to feel safe, I remember his words. I'm interested in you. And I wonder if he's still out there, still interested, still waiting for his chance to finish what he started on that sunny Sunday morning. So I stay vigilant. I keep my doors locked and my eyes open. And I pray that someday I'll be able to walk outside without looking over my shoulder, without seeing his face in every stranger I pass. But for now, the fear remains. An unwelcome house guest that refuses to leave. A constant reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, even in your own front yard on a lazy Sunday morning. Everything was going smoothly for the first couple hours. Neighbors chatted amiably as they perused the items, haggling good-naturedly over prices. Kids excitedly dug through boxes of old toys. It felt like any other community gathering. Then he showed up, an elderly man I'd never seen before. He must have been in his late 70s or early 80s, slightly stooped with thinning white hair. At first I didn't pay him much attention as he slowly made his way around the tables. But then I noticed him hovering near a set of antique porcelain dishes I had put out. Those dishes held sentimental value for me. They had belonged to my grandmother, and I had fond memories of holiday dinners served on them when I was a child. I had debated even including them in the sale, but ultimately decided it was time to let them go. The old man picked up one of the plates, turning it over in his hands and squinting at the maker's mark on the bottom. "How much for the set?" he asked gruffly. I walked over and told him the price I had settled on, $200 for the full 12-piece set. It was probably worth more, but I wanted them to go to someone who would appreciate them. His eyes widened. $200? Highway robbery, he exclaimed. I'll give you $50 for the lot. I shook my head, explaining that the dishes were antiques and had sentimental value. I was firm on the price. The man's demeanor changed instantly. His face reddened and he puffed up indignantly. "Listen here, young lady," he said, jabbing a finger at me. "I've been collecting fine china for 60 years. I know what these are worth, and it sure as hell ain't $200. You're trying to fleece me." I was taken aback by his sudden hostility. I tried to calmly explain again that the price was firm, but he wasn't having it. He continued berating me, his voice rising. Other shoppers were starting to stare. "Sir, please lower your voice," I said, glancing around uncomfortably. "If you're not interested in purchasing them, that's fine, but I'm not changing the price." He snatched up the stack of plates. "I'm taking these for $50 and that's final," he declared. Alarmed, I reached out and grabbed the other side of the stack. "No, you're not," I said firmly. "Put those down right now or I'm calling the police." We were in a bizarre tug-of-war over the dishes, each of us pulling them towards ourselves. I could feel the delicate porcelain straining between us. "Let go, you stupid woman," he shouted. "You let go," I yelled back. It all happened so fast. He yanked hard on the plates just as I was trying to wrench them away. The sudden force threw him off balance. He stumbled backwards, tripping over the leg of a nearby table. The plates went flying as he fell. There was a sickening crunch as he landed hard on his back. Shards of broken porcelain scattered across the grass around him. For a moment, everything was silent except for his pained wheezing. Then I saw the blood. A jagged piece of plate was protruding from his abdomen, dark red quickly spreading across his shirt. My hand flew to my mouth in horror as I realized what had happened. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Someone call 911. People sprang into action. A neighbor who was a nurse rushed over to the old man's side. Someone else was on the phone with emergency services. I stood there frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The nurse was applying pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. But there was so much blood. The old man's eyes were wide with shock and pain. "Hold on, sir," the nurse was saying. "Help is on the way. Just stay with us." But I could see the light fading from his eyes. By the time the ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, he was already gone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Police took statements from witnesses. The coroner came to remove the body. I answered question after question in a daze. How could this have happened? One minute we were arguing over dishes, and the next, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The guilt was overwhelming. If I had just let him have the plates for $50, none of this would have occurred. A man was dead because of my stubbornness over some stupid dishes. Word spread quickly through our small town. By that evening, everyone knew what had transpired at my yard sale. The next day, I could feel people staring as I walked down the street. Whispers followed me in the grocery store. "That's her, the one who killed that poor old man." I heard she pushed him deliberately. Such a tragedy. And over what? A few plates? I wanted to scream that it was an accident, that I never meant for anyone to get hurt. But the piercing looks and hushed conversations continued. Some neighbors tried to be supportive, bringing over casseroles and offering condolences. But I could sense their discomfort, the way they avoided meeting my eyes. The old man's family was devastated, understandably. His daughter came to my house, tears streaming down her face, demanding to know how I could let this happen. I had no words to comfort her. As the days passed, the atmosphere in town grew more and more oppressive. I could feel the judgment and blame everywhere I went. People crossed the street to avoid passing me on the sidewalk. Parents hurried their children away when they saw me coming. I stopped going out except when absolutely necessary. I couldn't bear the accusing stares, the hushed whispers that fell silent when I walked by. My phone stopped ringing. Invitations to social gatherings dried up. Even my closest friends began to distance themselves. "We just need some time," they said awkwardly. "I'm sure people will move on eventually." But they didn't. If anything, the hostility seemed to grow over time. Ugly rumors circulated about my temper, my greed, my callousness. Never mind that those who knew me would have said I was kind and generous to a fault before this. Now I was a pariah, a murderer in the eyes of the town. After a few weeks, I came home to find "killer" spray painted across my garage door in red letters. That was the final straw. I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. I put my house on the market and started looking for jobs in other cities. It broke my heart to leave the town I'd called home for over a decade, but I knew I would never be able to escape the shadow of what happened that terrible day. As I packed up my belongings, I came across the remaining unbroken plates from that porcelain set. I stared at them for a long moment, awash in grief and regret. Then I carefully wrapped each one and placed them in a box marked "Donate." I still have nightmares about that day sometimes. The old man's accusing eyes haunt me. I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of shattering porcelain echoing in my ears. I've tried to move on with my life in a new city where no one knows my past. But the guilt and trauma linger. A simple yard sale turned into tragedy in the blink of an eye, forever altering the course of my life. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that day. I never thought a simple yard sale would lead me down such a dark and twisted path. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning when I decided to check out some local sales in my neighborhood. I love browsing through other people's cast-offs, always on the hunt for hidden treasures or unique knickknacks. Little did I know that this particular outing would change my life forever. As I wandered from house to house, I came across a rather unassuming sale. The items were spread out haphazardly on folding tables and tarps on the lawn. Nothing really caught my eye at first glance, just the usual assortment of old kitchenware, outdated electronics, and worn clothing. I was about to move on when something tucked away under one of the tables caught my attention. It was an old cardboard box, battered and faded with age. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the way it was half hidden, as if someone had tried to keep it out of sight. I crouched down to get a better look. The box was sealed with yellowed packing tape, clearly untouched for many years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I called over to the elderly man running the sale. "Excuse me, how much for this box?" I asked, pointing it out. He shuffled over, squinting at it through thick glasses. "Oh, that old thing? Didn't even realize it was there. $5 and it's yours," he replied with a dismissive wave. I hesitated for a moment. Did I really want to spend money on a mystery box that was likely full of junk? But something told me I needed to see what was inside. I handed over a crumpled $5 bill and lugged the surprisingly heavy box to my car. When I got home, I set it on the kitchen table and carefully cut through the aged tape. My husband, Tom, watched with mild interest as I opened the flaps. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The box was filled to the brim with newspaper clippings, all yellowed and brittle with age. But it wasn't just random old papers. Every single article was about the same thing: an unidentified murder victim found in our town back in 1992. The infamous Jane Doe case that had gone unsolved for decades. I started sifting through the clippings with shaking hands. There were dozens of articles spanning several years, all meticulously cut out and preserved. They detailed the discovery of the body, the fruitless investigation, pleas to the public for information. My stomach churned as I read the grisly details. A young woman found strangled and dumped in a remote wooded area, her face beaten beyond recognition. But the newspaper clippings weren't the only contents of the box. Tucked in between the papers were photographs. Not the crime scene photos I'd expected, but personal snapshots. They showed a smiling young woman with long dark hair, sometimes alone and sometimes with friends or family. My heart pounded as I realized this must be the victim before her death. How did these private photos end up here? There was more. A small notebook filled with handwritten names, addresses, and phone numbers. A tarnished locket. A library card. And at the very bottom, a driver's license for a woman named Linda Carter. The pieces started to fall into place in my mind. This box contained the personal belongings and identity of the Jane Doe victim. "Tom, we need to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. This is evidence from an unsolved murder." He came over to look at the contents of the box, his face growing pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. How did this end up at some random yard sale? And why didn't the seller say anything about it? I shook my head, at a loss for words. We carefully repacked everything and called the local police department. They sent 2 detectives over within the hour. I'll never forget the looks on their faces as we showed them what we'd found. They handled each item with reverence, photographing and cataloging it all. The senior detective, a gruff older man, actually had tears in his eyes as he examined the photos of the smiling young woman. "This case has haunted me for nearly 30 years," he said quietly. "We never had a name, never knew who she was, and now—" They took the box and its contents into evidence, assuring us it would be thoroughly examined for new leads. Before they left, the detective turned to me. "Ma'am, I don't know how or why this ended up where it did, but you may have just helped solve one of the most tragic cold cases in our town's history. Thank you." I nodded, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Relief that the truth might finally come out, horror at the tragedy this poor woman had endured, and a gnawing dread about how her personal effects had ended up discarded at a yard sale. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to get the image of Linda's smiling face out of my mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most disturbingly, who had kept this box of her belongings all these years, only to carelessly sell it off? The next morning, my unease had solidified into resolve. I needed to know more. I headed back to the neighborhood where I'd bought the box, determined to talk to the seller again. But when I got there, the house was empty. A for sale sign stood in the overgrown yard. I knocked on the neighbors' doors, asking if anyone knew what had happened to the elderly man. Most just shrugged, saying he'd kept to himself. But one woman's eyes widened when I mentioned the yard sale. "Oh, honey, there wasn't any yard sale there yesterday," she said. "That house has been empty for months. The old man who lived there passed away last year." A chill ran down my spine. I stammered out a thank you and hurried back to my car. My mind was reeling. How was this possible? I know what I saw, what I bought. The box was real. The police had it now. But the sale itself, had it all been some kind of hallucination? I drove home in a daze, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. When I got there, 2 police cars were parked outside. My heart sank. The detectives were grim-faced as they told me what they'd discovered. The fingerprints on the items in the box didn't match the victim or any suspects. They matched mine, and only mine. "Mrs. Johnson, we're going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions," one said, not unkindly. I nodded numbly, following them to the car. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a young woman with long, dark hair staring back at me. What have I done? The thought echoed in my mind as we headed towards the police station. What horrible truth was waiting to be uncovered? And most chillingly, what part had I played in it all those years ago? The rest of that day passed in a blur of interrogation rooms, lie detector tests, and increasingly probing questions. I told my story over and over, insisting I knew nothing about the murder or the origin of the box beyond finding it at the yard sale. But with each retelling, I felt less and less certain of my own memories. Had I really been to a yard sale? Or had I found that box somewhere else, somewhere I'd buried deep in my subconscious? The detectives showed me security camera footage from the neighborhood. There was no sign of any sale that day, no sign of me or anyone else on that street. As night fell, they finally let me go home, but made it clear the investigation was far from over. Tom was waiting for me, worry etched on his face. I collapsed into his arms, my mind swirling with doubts and fragmented images. That night, my dreams were a chaotic jumble. I saw flashes of woods, heard muffled screams, felt my hands around someone's throat. I jolted awake, covered in sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Tom held me as I sobbed, unable to distinguish memory from nightmare. The next few weeks were a waking nightmare. Our quiet life was turned upside down as police and media descended. I was questioned again and again, my past scrutinized for any connection to Linda Carter or the area where her body was found. Friends and neighbors looked at me with suspicion or pity. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. Hypnosis sessions revealed buried memories of a troubled adolescence, a secret life I'd somehow managed to completely forget. I'd known Linda. We'd been friends, or maybe more than friends. There were flashes of arguments, jealousy, blackouts fueled by drugs and alcohol, but I still couldn't remember what had happened that terrible night in 1992. Had I killed her in a drug-induced rage? Had I witnessed her murder and blocked it out? Or was my mind playing cruel tricks, making me doubt my own innocence? DNA testing of the evidence in the box proved inconclusive. There was no smoking gun linking me definitively to Linda's death. But there was also no explanation for how I'd come to possess her belongings, how my fingerprints were the only ones present. In the end, there wasn't enough evidence to charge me with murder. But the shadow of suspicion would hang over me for the rest of my life. Tom stood by me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes sometimes. I'd lost friends, my job, my sense of who I was. Months have passed since that fateful day at the non-existent yard sale. I still don't have answers. Some days I'm convinced of my innocence. Other days I'm terrified of what I might be capable of. The nightmares continue, blurring the line between past and present. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to untangle the knots in my psyche. But part of me wonders if some truths are better left buried. What if remembering destroys what's left of my life, of my sanity? All I know for certain is that an innocent young woman lost her life decades ago. Whether by my hand or another's, she deserves justice. So I keep digging, keep trying to pierce the fog of my own mind. Maybe someday I'll find the truth. Or maybe the truth will find me, ready or not. Until then, I live each day haunted by the face in those old photographs. Linda Carter, the Jane Doe who wasn't, whose life and death have become inextricably tangled with my own. Wherever you are, Linda, I'm sorry. And I promise I won't stop until I know what really happened to you. I never thought I'd be the one writing something like this, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened that day in January 2019 still haunts me. I can't shake the images, the sounds, the overwhelming sense of fear and confusion. It was supposed to be just another cold winter day in Houston. My wife Liz and I had been planning a big trip for months, saving up every spare penny we could. Liz had the brilliant idea to have a yard sale to raise some extra cash for our vacation fund. She was always coming up with creative ideas like that. That morning, Liz was up early, bustling around getting everything set up in the driveway. I offered to help, but she insisted I stay inside where it was warm. "I've got this, babe," she said with that bright smile of hers. "You just focus on making us some coffee." So I did what she asked, watching from the kitchen window as she arranged old clothes and knickknacks on folding tables. I'll never forgive myself for not being out there with her. I had just poured our coffee when I heard it, 4 loud cracks in rapid succession. At first, my brain didn't process what was happening. Fireworks, construction noise, but deep down, I knew. Those were gunshots. I ran outside, my heart pounding out of my chest. The mug slipped from my hand, hot coffee splashing across the floor. But I didn't care. I had to get to Liz. The scene in our driveway is forever burned into my memory. Liz was lying there, so still, surrounded by the items she'd been arranging just moments before. There was so much blood. I fell to my knees beside her, frantically trying to find a pulse, begging her to stay with me. But I knew it was too late. My beautiful, vibrant Liz was gone. I became aware of shouting, of neighbors running toward us. Someone was on the phone with 911. A woman, I think it was Mrs. Chen from across the street, was saying something about a black pickup truck speeding away. But it all felt distant, unreal. All I could focus on was Liz's face, her eyes staring blankly at the cold January sky. The next few hours were a blur. Police swarming our quiet street, detectives asking questions I could barely process, crime scene tape transforming our home into something unrecognizable. I answered their questions as best I could, but I had no answers. Who would want to hurt Liz? She was the kindest, most loving person I knew. Everyone in the neighborhood adored her. As the shock began to wear off, the reality of what happened started to sink in. My wife, my best friend, the person I was supposed to grow old with, had been brutally murdered in our own driveway. For what? We didn't have enemies. We weren't involved in anything illegal. It made no sense. The days and weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Liz lying there. I kept replaying that morning over and over, torturing myself with what-ifs. What if I had insisted on helping her? What if we had decided not to have the yard sale that day? The police did their best. I know they did. They canvassed the neighborhood, reviewed security camera footage, followed up on every lead. They released a video of the black pickup truck leaving the scene, hoping someone would recognize it. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, it became clear that Liz's killer might never be caught. The impact on our community was profound. People were scared, locking their doors even during the day, eyeing strangers with suspicion. Our once friendly neighborhood became a place of fear and mistrust. I couldn't bear to stay in our house, surrounded by memories of Liz and the constant reminders of that terrible day. I moved in with my sister across town, but our neighbors, bless them, they didn't forget Liz. On the anniversary of her death, I drove by our old house to find the driveway covered in yellow roses, Liz's favorite. There was a small vigil, people sharing memories of her kindness and warmth. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It's been over 4 years now, and the case remains unsolved. The police still call occasionally with updates, but I can hear the resignation in their voices. They're running out of leads, out of hope. But I can't give up. Liz deserves justice. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I find myself looking at every black pickup truck I see, wondering if the driver is the one who took my Liz from me. Is he out there, living his life as if nothing happened? Does he even think about the life he destroyed that day? I still have nightmares about that morning. I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those 4 gunshots echoing in my mind. The grief and anger are still so raw, so overwhelming at times. But I try to honor Liz's memory by living the way she would have wanted me to, with kindness and hope. To whoever did this, I don't know who you are or why you took my wife from me, but know this: I will never stop searching for the truth. Liz deserves justice, and I won't rest until she gets it. And to anyone reading this who might know something, anything about what happened that day, please, I beg you, come forward. Even the smallest detail could be the key to solving this case. Help me find peace. Help me find justice for Liz. I miss her every single day. Her laugh, her smile, the way she could light up a room just by walking into it. The world is a darker place without her in it. But I have to believe that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. For Liz's sake, and for the sake of our community that still lives in fear, I have to keep hoping. If you're out there, whoever you are, know that you didn't just take one life that day. You shattered countless others. But we're still here, still fighting for justice. And we won't give up until we get it. I never thought a simple yard sale find would turn my life upside down. But here I am, still shaken by what happened just last week. It was a typical Saturday morning, and I decided to check out some local yard sales, hoping to score some cool vintage items or hidden treasures. Little did I know that I was about to stumble upon something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I spotted this old metal box at one of the sales. It looked pretty beat up, but had an intriguing antique vibe. The elderly woman running the sale said it had belonged to her late uncle, who was a chemist. She was asking $5 for it, which seemed like a steal. I handed over the cash without a second thought and tossed the box in my trunk, excited to examine my new find when I got home. Once I was back in my apartment, I set the box on my kitchen table and carefully pried open the rusty latch. Inside was a strange metallic sphere about the size of a baseball, covered in bizarre symbols I'd never seen before. There were also some old yellowed papers with complex equations and diagrams. I was instantly fascinated. It felt like I'd stumbled onto some kind of scientific relic, or maybe even a movie prop. I snapped a few photos of the sphere and papers on my phone, planning to post them online later to see if anyone could shed light on what they might be. The sphere was surprisingly heavy for its size, with an odd smoothness to its surface. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed it felt slightly warm to the touch, which I chalked up to it sitting in my hot car earlier. That evening, I uploaded the photos to a collector's forum I frequented, asking if anyone recognized the symbols or could make sense of the equations. I went to bed feeling pretty excited about my mysterious yard sale score. I woke up the next morning to a flurry of notifications. Most were expressing amazement at the find, but one comment in particular made my blood run cold. A user claiming to work in nuclear safety had messaged me urgently, saying the sphere appeared to match the description of a lost radioactive source from decades ago. They strongly advised me not to handle the object any further and to contact authorities immediately. My mind started racing. Radioactive? Surely that couldn't be right. But as I read through the details they provided, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. The user explained that the particular shape and markings were consistent with certain types of industrial radiography sources used in the mid-20th century. Some of these sources had gone missing over the years and were considered extremely dangerous if mishandled. I ran to the kitchen where I'd left the box on the table. With shaking hands, I pulled up a radiation detection app on my phone. I'd downloaded it ages ago out of idle curiosity, never thinking I'd actually need it. To my horror, the levels it showed were way above normal background radiation. Panic set in as I realized I'd been casually handling this thing, keeping it in my home overnight. Was I already exposed? What about my neighbors? I backed away from the table, my mind reeling. I needed help, and fast. With trembling fingers, I called the non-emergency police line, trying to explain the situation without sounding like a lunatic. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but as I relayed the details about the yard sale, the markings, and the online warning, her tone shifted to one of serious concern. She told me to leave my apartment immediately and wait outside for emergency services to arrive. I grabbed my phone and keys and bolted out the door, not even bothering to change out of my pajamas. As I paced nervously on the sidewalk, I saw my neighbors giving me strange looks. How could I explain this? "Oh, don't mind me, just waiting for the hazmat team because I bought a radioactive sphere at a yard sale." It sounded insane even in my own head. Within 20 minutes, the street was filled with flashing lights, police cars, fire trucks, and what looked like some kind of special response vehicle pulled up. Men in intimidating protective suits climbed out, carrying all sorts of equipment I couldn't even begin to identify. I was quickly ushered into an ambulance where paramedics began checking me over. They asked a barrage of questions. How long had I handled the object? Did I experience any unusual symptoms? Had I noticed any strange marks or burns on my skin? The reality of the danger I'd unknowingly brought into my home was really starting to sink in. Meanwhile, the team in protective gear had entered my apartment. I watched anxiously from the ambulance as they emerged a while later, carefully carrying a large lead container. One of them approached me, his face serious behind his protective mask. "Sir, we've secured the radioactive source. It appears to be a radium-226 sphere, likely from an old industrial radiography setup. It's emitting dangerously high levels of gamma radiation. You're incredibly lucky you contacted us when you did." He went on to explain that while my brief exposure was concerning, it likely wasn't immediately life-threatening. However, I'd need to undergo some medical tests and monitoring in the coming weeks to assess any potential health impacts. They were also going to need to do a thorough sweep of my apartment to check for any residual contamination. As if the situation wasn't surreal enough already, a group of official-looking people in suits arrived and started questioning me about where I'd gotten the sphere. I told them about the yard sale and gave them the address. They exchanged worried glances and hurried off, presumably to investigate further. The next few hours were a blur of decontamination procedures, more medical checks, and what felt like endless questioning from various officials. By the time I was finally cleared to return to my apartment that evening, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. Walking back into my home, everything looked the same, and yet it all felt different. The kitchen table where the box had sat was now covered in plastic sheeting. There were little stickers everywhere marking spots that had been tested for radiation. It was like a scene from some sci-fi movie, except this was my actual life. I collapsed onto my couch, my mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. How could a simple $5 purchase at a yard sale turn into this nightmare? I thought about the elderly woman who sold me the box. Did she have any idea what her uncle had left behind? Was she in danger too? Over the next few days, I learned more about what had transpired. Apparently, the sphere was a highly radioactive source that had gone missing from a research facility decades ago. The woman's uncle, who had worked there, had somehow ended up with it and stored it away, perhaps not fully understanding its danger. When he passed away, it ended up forgotten in that old metal box. The authorities assured me that they had tracked down the woman and checked her home, fortunately finding no other radioactive materials. She was as shocked as I was to learn about the true nature of what she'd unknowingly been storing in her attic for years. It's been a week now, and I'm still grappling with what happened. I've had to undergo several medical tests, and while the doctors say my radiation exposure was limited, I'll need to be monitored for potential long-term effects. The incident made local news, turning me into a minor celebrity of sorts. though it's not the kind of fame I ever wanted. I find myself jumping at every little health concern, wondering if it's related to the radiation. A headache, a bout of nausea, even just feeling tired. My mind immediately races to worst-case scenarios. The doctors have assured me that any radiation sickness symptoms would have shown up by now, but it's hard not to worry. My apartment still doesn't feel quite the same. Even though it's been cleared as safe, I can't help but eye that kitchen table warily every time I walk past. I've found myself researching radiation and its effects obsessively, which probably isn't helping my anxiety. The whole experience has left me with a deep sense of unease about the hidden dangers that might be lurking in everyday objects. I used to love the thrill of finding unique items at yard sales and flea markets. Now, the thought of going to one makes me break out in a cold sweat. What else might be out there, sitting harmlessly on someone's shelf, waiting to be discovered? I know rationally that the chances of something like this happening again are astronomically low, but that doesn't stop the nagging fear in the back of my mind. Every time I see a yard sale sign now, I feel a twinge of anxiety. The innocence of treasure hunting has been forever tainted for me. In a weird way, I feel lucky. Lucky that I posted those photos online and got that warning. Lucky that I took it seriously and called for help. I shudder to think what might have happened if I'd just kept that sphere sitting in my home, slowly irradiating everything around it. This experience has been a harsh reminder of how little we sometimes know about the things we bring into our lives. It's made me much more cautious and aware of the potential risks hiding in seemingly innocent objects. I doubt I'll ever look at a yard sale the same way again. So, if you're out there hunting for unique finds and hidden treasures, just remember my story. That amazing deal might not always be what it seems. And if you ever come across a strange metallic sphere with odd symbols, for the love of all that is holy, don't bring it home. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It started off normal enough. I had spent the week sorting through boxes in the attic and garage, pricing items, and setting up folding tables in the driveway. By 8 a.m., everything was laid out neatly. Old toys, books, kitchenware, you name it. A steady trickle of people were browsing and making small talk. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. I remember thinking what a nice day it was turning out to be. Around 10:30, I noticed a large dog wandering into the yard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dogs often roamed the neighborhood, and this one seemed calm enough. It was some kind of pit bull mix, muscular with a broad head. As it sniffed around the tables, a few people gave it a wide berth, but it wasn't acting aggressive. I was in the middle of wrapping up a ceramic vase for Mrs. Henderson from down the street when I heard a loud crash. I looked up to see the dog had bumped into one of the card tables, knocking it over and sending dishes clattering to the ground. Before I could even process what was happening, the dog started barking and growling, hackles raised. Everything happened so fast after that. The dog lunged at a small terrier that was with its owner, grabbing it by the neck and shaking violently. People started screaming and running. I froze in shock for a moment before my instincts kicked in, and I started yelling at the dog to let go. A man, I think his name was Dave, tried to intervene, grabbing the dog's collar to pull it off the smaller dog. But that only redirected the pit bull's aggression. It whirled around and clamped its jaws on Dave's forearm. The sound of his scream is something I'll never forget. At this point, pure chaos had erupted. People were fleeing in all directions. Tables were overturned, scattering knickknacks and glassware across the lawn. I saw a woman trip and fall as she tried to run, cutting her hands on broken shards. The terrier's owner was sobbing hysterically, cradling her limp dog. I stood there paralyzed, unsure what to do. Should I try to help Dave? Run inside and call 911? Find something to use as a weapon? My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't move. Just then, a man came sprinting from a few houses down, shouting the dog's name. "Rocky! Rocky! Stop!" It was clearly the owner. He managed to grab the dog's collar and wrestle it to the ground, but not before it had done serious damage. Dave's arm was a mangled, bloody mess. He had collapsed to his knees, face pale with shock. Someone had called an ambulance, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. The dog's owner had Rocky pinned down, but the animal was still snarling and snapping, trying to break free. "I'm so sorry," the man kept saying over and over. "He's never done anything like this before. I don't know what happened." As the paramedics arrived and started tending to Dave, I surveyed the scene in disbelief. My peaceful yard sale had been transformed into something out of a horror movie. Broken glass and splintered wood littered the grass. Blood stained the pavement of the driveway. Discarded shoes and purses were strewn about, left behind as people fled. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police took statements. Animal control came to take the dog away. Dave was rushed to the hospital. I later learned he needed extensive surgery and suffered permanent nerve damage in his arm. The small terrier, sadly, didn't survive. I felt numb as I tried to clean up the debris left behind. Shards of my grandmother's china crunched under my feet. A child's teddy bear lay torn and dirty in a puddle of blood. How had this happened? This was my quiet, safe neighborhood. These were my friends and neighbors. In the span of 10 minutes, everything had changed. The trauma of that day lingered long after the physical evidence was gone. For weeks, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sounds of screaming and snarling echoing in my head. I'd flinch at any dog I saw on the street, even the friendliest-looking ones. My yard sat empty. I couldn't bring myself to go out there, let alone host another sale. The community was shaken too. People stopped letting their kids play outside unsupervised. The annual block party was canceled. A sense of wariness crept in where there had once been easy trust between neighbors. Months later, I'm still trying to process what happened. I've replayed those terrifying moments over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have noticed warning signs in the dog's behavior? Could I have acted faster to prevent the attacks? The guilt and second-guessing eat away at me, but I'm also angry. Angry at the dog's owner for not securing his animal properly. Angry at the randomness of it all, how a beautiful day could turn so ugly in an instant. Mostly, I'm angry at how this incident stole our sense of safety and community. I know logically that what happened that day was a freak occurrence. Millions of yard sales happen every weekend without incident. But knowing that doesn't erase the visceral memories or make me feel any safer. I still get anxious in crowds. I still have nightmares about snarling dogs and the sound of bones crunching. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly at ease again. Will I always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next random act of violence? Or will the fear eventually fade, allowing me to enjoy simple pleasures like a neighborhood yard sale without constant dread? I don't have answers. All I know is that life can change in an instant. One moment you're haggling over the price of an old lamp, the next you're in the middle of a bloodbath. I'm grateful that no one was killed that day, but the scars, both physical and emotional, will last a lifetime. So if you're planning a yard sale, or any community event really, stay vigilant. You never know when a normal day might take a horrific turn. And give your neighbors a hug. You don't realize how precious that sense of safety and belonging is until it's shattered. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened that day. Part of me wants to move away, start fresh somewhere new, but another part feels like running away would be letting fear win. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to rebuild my sense of security brick by brick. The yard sale incident taught me that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, but it also showed me the strength of community in times of crisis. Neighbors I barely knew before stepped up to help in the aftermath, bringing meals, offering support, checking in on those most affected. So while the scars remain, I'm choosing to focus on healing and reconnection rather than isolation. It's a slow process, but I have to believe that someday I'll be able to look out at my front yard without reliving the horror of that day. Until then, I'll keep working through the trauma, cherishing the quiet moments, and never taking safety for granted again. I never thought I'd witness something so horrifying at a simple yard sale. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and I had decided to take a stroll through my neighborhood to enjoy the nice weather. As I walked down Oak Street, I noticed an elderly gentleman setting up tables in his front yard, carefully arranging various knickknacks, books, and porcelain figurines. The old man, who I later learned was Mr. Johnson, had a kind face etched with wrinkles that spoke of a life well lived. He greeted me with a warm smile as I approached, and we struck up a friendly conversation. He explained that he was selling some of his belongings to declutter his home, including items that had belonged to his late wife. I could sense the bittersweet nature of the task in his voice. I browsed the tables, admiring the eclectic collection of items. There was a set of delicate porcelain teacups that caught my eye, and Mr. Johnson shared that they had been a wedding gift to him and his wife over 50 years ago. The love and nostalgia in his eyes as he spoke about her were truly touching. As I was contemplating whether to buy the teacups, a group of teenagers rounded the corner onto our street. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as they approached Mr. Johnson's yard, I felt an uneasy tension in the air. There were 5 of them, all boys, probably around 16 or 17 years old. They swaggered up to the tables, snickering and nudging each other. One of them, a tall boy with spiky hair, picked up a book and flipped through it carelessly. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "How much for this piece of junk?" Mr. Johnson, ever patient, replied politely, "That's a first edition, young man. It's priced at $20. The boy laughed and tossed the book back onto the table, causing it to knock over a small vase. Mr. Johnson rushed to catch it, but he wasn't quick enough. The vase shattered on the ground, and I saw a flash of pain cross the old man's face. "Oops," the spiky-haired boy said, not sounding sorry at all. His friends laughed, emboldened by his behavior. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to intervene, to tell these kids to leave, but another part of me was afraid. They were much younger and stronger than me, and there was a dangerous glint in their eyes that made me hesitate. Mr. Johnson tried to maintain his composure. "Please be careful with the items," he said, his voice slightly shaky. "Many of them are quite fragile and hold sentimental value." This only seemed to egg the boys on. They started picking up items roughly, pretending to examine them before setting them down with unnecessary force. I watched in horror as a beautiful porcelain figurine of a ballerina teetered on the edge of the table before crashing to the ground. "That was my wife's favorite," Mr. Johnson said softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Please, boys, I'm asking you to leave if you're not interested in buying anything." The spiky-haired boy, clearly the leader, turned to Mr. Johnson with a sneer. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna make us?" I felt sick to my stomach. How could these kids be so cruel? I wanted to say something, to step in, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was terrified of becoming their next target. Mr. Johnson straightened his back, summoning his courage. "I'll call the police if I have to," he said, his voice firmer now. "What you're doing is destruction of property." For a moment, I thought this threat might make the boys back down. Instead, it seemed to flip a switch in them. The leader's face contorted with anger, and before I could even process what was happening, he shoved Mr. Johnson hard. The old man stumbled backward, losing his balance. He fell to the ground with a painful thud, and I heard a sickening crack that I prayed wasn't a bone breaking. The other boys, as if given permission by their leader's actions, descended on Mr. Johnson like a pack of wolves. I watched in abject horror as they began to kick and punch the helpless man on the ground. Mr. Johnson tried to protect himself, curling into a ball and raising his arms to shield his face, but he was no match for the brutal onslaught. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run over and pull those monsters off of him, but I was paralyzed with fear. Shame washed over me in waves as I stood there, a useless bystander to this horrific assault. One of the boys grabbed the teacups I had been admiring earlier and smashed them on the ground next to Mr. Johnson's head. The sound of breaking porcelain mixed with the old man's pained groans and the cruel laughter of the teenagers. I don't know how long the attack lasted. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, someone down the street must have heard the commotion and shouted that they were calling the police. The boys scattered like cockroaches when a light is turned on, running off down the street and disappearing around the corner. I rushed to Mr. Johnson's side, my legs finally remembering how to move. He was conscious but badly beaten. His face was already swelling. Blood trickled from his nose and a cut on his forehead, and he winced in pain when he tried to move. I gently helped him into a sitting position, apologizing over and over for not intervening sooner. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice weak and shaky. "You could have been hurt too." His forgiveness only made me feel worse. I should have done something, anything, to stop this senseless violence. The police arrived a few minutes later, followed closely by an ambulance. As the paramedics tended to Mr. Johnson, I gave my statement to the officers, describing the boys as best I could. I felt utterly useless, knowing that my description probably wouldn't be enough to catch them. As they loaded Mr. Johnson into the ambulance, I surveyed the damage to his yard sale. Broken porcelain and glass littered the ground, books lay scattered and bent, and the tables were overturned. It looked like a war zone. I spent the rest of the day helping Mr. Johnson's neighbors clean up the mess, but nothing could erase the memory of what I'd witnessed. The image of those boys attacking a helpless old man was seared into my brain. I visited Mr. Johnson in the hospital the next day. He had a concussion, 2 broken ribs, and numerous cuts and bruises. Despite his injuries, he managed a small smile when he saw me. His resilience was astounding, but I could see the trauma behind his eyes. It's been weeks since that horrible day, and I still can't shake the guilt and shame I feel for not doing more to help. The police never caught the boys responsible, and I doubt they ever will. Mr. Johnson is recovering slowly, but I know he'll never be the same. This experience has shaken my faith in humanity. How could anyone, especially young people with their whole lives ahead of them, be so cruel to a kind, defenseless old man? I find myself looking at teenagers on the street differently now, always wondering if they were the ones who did this. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for standing by and watching. The memory of Mr. Johnson on the ground, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his life with his wife, haunts me. I hope that by sharing this story, I can encourage others to speak up and act when they see injustice. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't be a bystander, because the guilt of inaction is a heavy burden to bear, and the consequences for those we fail to protect can be devastating. I live in a small town in Tennessee, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Back in 2015, I was friends with Karen Swift. We weren't super close, but we'd chat at school pickup and community events. She was always so warm and friendly, with a smile for everyone. On October 30th that year, Karen was having a yard sale. I stopped by in the morning to check it out, and we got to talking. She seemed a bit distracted and mentioned she was going through a divorce, but was trying to stay positive for her kids. I remember thinking how strong she was, dealing with all that and still finding time to organize a sale. As I was leaving, Karen said she was planning to go to a Halloween party that night at the country club. She asked if I wanted to come along, but I had plans with my family. I waved goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time I'd ever see her. The next morning, my phone started blowing up with messages. Karen was missing. At first I thought it must be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Maybe she'd stayed at a friend's after the party. But as the hours ticked by and there was still no sign of her, a sick feeling started to grow in my stomach. The whole community mobilized to search for Karen. I joined in, combing through fields and wooded areas, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. But there was no trace of her anywhere. Days turned into weeks. The police questioned everyone, including me. I told them about our conversation at the yard sale, wishing I had some crucial piece of information that could help. But I didn't. No one seemed to know anything. As time passed, hope began to fade. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in December. I was at home, scrolling through social media, when I saw the news. They'd found Karen's body. It was dumped in a remote area, hidden under some vines. The article mentioned signs of head trauma. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The next few days were a blur. Our small town was reeling. How could this happen here? To someone we all knew and loved. Rumors started flying. People whispered about Karen's husband, David. They were going through a divorce after all, but nothing was ever proven. I attended Karen's funeral, still in shock. Seeing her kids there, trying to be brave but clearly devastated, broke my heart. I kept thinking about our last conversation, how normal everything had seemed. How could I have known it would be the last time? As the investigation dragged on, it became clear that there might not be any answers. No arrests were made. The case went cold. But for those of us who knew Karen, it was impossible to move on. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying that day in my mind. Could I have done something differently? Said something? Noticed something? The guilt ate at me, even though logically I knew there was nothing I could have done. Years have passed now, but Karen's case still haunts our town. Every Halloween, I think about her, about the party she never made it to, about her kids growing up without their mom, about the person who did this, still walking free. Sometimes when I'm out running errands, I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like Karen. For a split second, my heart races. But then reality comes crashing back. She's gone, and we may never know why. The not knowing is the hardest part. Was it random? Was it someone she knew? These questions keep me up at night. I've become hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder. If it could happen to Karen, it could happen to anyone. I've tried to be there for Karen's family as much as I can. Her kids are older now, but the pain is still there in their eyes. They deserve answers. They deserve justice. But as each year passes, it seems less and less likely they'll ever get it. Sometimes I drive by Karen's old house. New people live there now, but I always slow down, remembering her yard sale, the last normal day before everything changed. I wonder if the new owners know the history of the place, if they feel the weight of what happened there. The whole experience has changed me. I used to think our town was safe, that bad things only happened in big cities or on TV. Now I know better. Evil can touch anyone, anywhere. It's a hard lesson to learn. I still catch myself looking for Karen sometimes, in a crowd or at the grocery store. It's like my brain can't fully accept that she's gone, that someone could just disappear like that, leaving so many questions behind. There are moments when I almost convince myself it was all a bad dream, that I'll run into Karen at the school pickup line and we'll laugh about this crazy misunderstanding. But then I see the missing person flyers that are still up around town, faded but persistent. A reminder that this is all too real. I've thought about moving away, starting fresh somewhere else. But something keeps me here. Maybe it's the hope that one day we'll get answers, that Karen's killer will be brought to justice. Or maybe it's just that I can't bear the thought of forgetting, of letting Karen become just another statistic. So I stay. I keep Karen's memory alive however I can. I talk to her kids when I see them around town, share stories about their mom. I attend the vigils held on the anniversary of her disappearance, and I keep hoping that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. But until then, I live with the knowledge that sometimes there are no answers, that people can vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartache. It's a heavy burden to bear, but it's one our whole community shares. Karen's case may be cold, but for those of us who knew her, it will never be closed. We'll keep searching, keep remembering, keep hoping, because that's all we can do. And maybe, just maybe, one day we'll finally know what happened on that October night when our friend disappeared forever. I'd been planning this sale for weeks, sorting through boxes in the attic and garage, pricing items, and setting up tables in the driveway. My husband Tom was out of town on a business trip, so I was handling it solo. No big deal, I thought. I've done plenty of these before. The morning started off normal enough. I got up early, made some coffee, and headed out front to finish setting up around 6:30 a.m. It was already getting hot and humid, typical Texas summer. A few early birds showed up right at 7 when I officially opened. I chatted with the regulars, haggled over prices on some old kitchen gadgets and kids' toys. Around 9, things had slowed down a bit. I was straightening up some clothes on a table when I noticed a beat-up white van pull up across the street. A man got out and started walking over. There was something off about him from the start. He was probably in his 40s, kind of scruffy looking, with greasy hair and ratty jeans. But it was more than that. The way he moved, how his eyes darted around. Every instinct told me to be on guard. He browsed for a few minutes, picking things up and putting them down without much interest. I tried to act casual, but kept a close eye on him. Finally, he approached me, holding an old vase. "How much?" he asked gruffly. $5, I replied, forcing a smile. He set it down and stepped closer. "You running this sale all by yourself?" A chill ran down my spine. "Oh no," I lied. "My husband's just inside getting more stuff to bring out." He smirked, clearly not buying it. "That so? Funny, I've been watching a while and ain't seen nobody else." My heart started racing. I glanced around, realizing we were the only ones there at the moment. The nearest neighbors weren't close enough to hear if I yelled. "Well, what else can I help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got some great deals on—" "I ain't here for your junk," he cut me off, his voice low and menacing. "Empty out that cash box, and maybe I won't have to hurt you." I froze, my mind racing. The cash box was just inside the garage. If I could get to it, maybe I could grab my phone too and call for help. But he was blocking my path. "Okay," I said, holding up my hands. "It's right inside. I'll go get it for you." I turned toward the garage, heart pounding. But I only made it a few steps before I felt his hand grab my arm roughly. "Not so fast," he growled. "You think I'm stupid? We're going together." He shoved me forward into the garage. I stumbled, nearly falling. As soon as we were out of sight from the street, he slammed me against the wall. The back of my head hit hard, and I saw stars. "Where's the money?" he demanded. "Over there," I gasped, pointing to a table where the cash box sat. "Please, just take it and go." He yanked me by the arm again, dragging me to the table. "Open it," he ordered. With shaking hands, I fumbled with the key and opened the box. There was maybe $200 inside from the morning's sales. He snatched it greedily, stuffing the bills in his pocket. I thought that would be the end of it, but then he grabbed me again, spinning me to face him. His eyes were wild, almost feral. "Nice wedding ring," he sneered. "Hand it over." "No, please," I begged. "It was my grandmother's." His face twisted with rage. He backhanded me hard across the face, sending me sprawling to the concrete floor. Pain exploded in my cheek and I tasted blood. "I said, give it to me, bitch," he yelled. Dazed and terrified, I struggled to pull the ring off my swollen finger. He grabbed my hand roughly, yanking it off himself. I lay there trembling as he pocketed the ring. What more did he want? Would he kill me? Just then, I heard a car door slam outside. The man's head whipped around. "Sounds like your husband's home," I said weakly, praying it was true. He hesitated for a moment, then bolted for the side door of the garage. I heard his footsteps pounding away, then the screech of tires as his van peeled off. I don't know how long I lay there crying before I managed to pull myself up. My whole body ached. I stumbled into the house and called 911 with trembling hands. The police came quickly, but of course the man was long gone. They took my statement and dusted for prints, but I knew it was useless. I couldn't give them much of a description beyond scruffy white guy in his 40s. I spent the next few days in a daze of fear and pain. Tom came home early and barely left my side. Friends and neighbors stopped by with food and offers of help. But I jumped at every sound, flinched when anyone came near me. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. It was about a week later that I first heard about the other attacks. A woman a few blocks over had been assaulted during her yard sale, then another across town. The details were eerily similar. Always women alone, always on weekend mornings. The whole community was on edge. People started canceling their sales or teaming up to run them together. Neighborhood watch groups formed. Local news ran constant updates and warnings. But the attacks kept happening. Every week or two, another woman would fall victim. Sometimes it was just robbery, other times assault. The violence seemed to be escalating. I gave more statements to the police, looked at countless mugshots, but nothing came of it. Months went by with no leads. We all lived in fear, wondering who would be next. It wasn't until September that they finally caught him. A group of volunteers had set up a sting operation, a fake garage sale with hidden cameras and plainclothes officers nearby. Sure enough, he showed up and tried to rob the woman running it. They took him down as he was fleeing. His name was Mark Eldridge. 43 years old, just like I'd guessed. He had a long record of petty crimes and domestic violence. They found my ring and several others in his van, along with weapons and stolen cash. I testified at his trial in December. It was terrifying to see him again, to relive that awful day. But it felt good to help put him away. He got 25 years. It's been almost 5 years now. The physical wounds healed long ago, but the emotional scars remain. I still have nightmares sometimes. I've never had another garage sale, and probably never will. Our community has mostly moved on, but things aren't quite the same. We're more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that can lurk behind a normal Saturday morning. The trust and innocence we once had is gone forever. I often think about the other women Eldridge attacked, especially the ones after me. I wonder if I could have done more, given a better description, somehow stopped him sooner. The guilt eats at me sometimes, but mostly I'm just grateful to have survived, to still be here with my family. I try to focus on that and not let the fear control me. It's not easy, but I refuse to let Eldridge win by living in terror forever. Still, I'll never forget that summer when garage sales became a source of terror in our town. It's a reminder of how quickly life can change, how evil can appear in the most mundane places. And it's why, to this day, I tense up every time I see a white van drive slowly down my street. My Uncle Rob was always into urban legends and local mysteries. He'd spend hours researching obscure folklore and dragging me along on his investigations. Most of the time, it was pretty boring stuff. Abandoned buildings that were supposedly haunted, bridges where people claimed to see ghost lights, that kind of thing. But the night we went to Jasper Hill to check out the strange lights people had reported seeing over the lake, that was different. That was real. It was a warm summer evening in late August. Uncle Rob picked me up after dinner, practically bouncing with excitement. "Tonight's the night, kiddo," he announced as I climbed into his beat-up Ford pickup. "We're finally going to see those Jasper Hill lights for ourselves." I tried to match his enthusiasm, but honestly, I was skeptical. We'd been on so many of these wild goose chases before that always turned out to be nothing. Still, I had to admit I was curious. The stories about the lights over Jasper Lake had been circulating for decades. People claimed to see strange, colorful orbs dancing across the water late at night. Some even said the lights would follow hikers through the woods. As we drove out to the park, Uncle Rob filled me in on his research. He'd been tracking lunar cycles, weather patterns, and sightings for months. Tonight was supposed to be ideal conditions. A new moon, clear skies, and right in the middle of the traditional active season for the lights. "I've got all the gear we need," he said, gesturing to the back of the truck. "Night vision goggles, high-powered binoculars, video camera. We'll document everything." I nodded along, still not fully convinced we'd see anything out of the ordinary. But as we turned onto the long, winding road leading into the park, I felt a flutter of nervous anticipation in my stomach. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out what little remaining daylight there was. By the time we reached the lakeside parking area, full darkness had fallen. Uncle Rob killed the engine, and we sat there for a moment, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. The silence was eerie, no crickets chirping, no owls hooting. just a heavy stillness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "All right, let's get set up," Uncle Rob said, a little too loudly. I could tell he was trying to cover his own nervousness. We grabbed the gear from the truck bed and made our way down to the pebbly beach. The lake stretched out before us, a vast expanse of inky blackness. For the next hour or so, we scanned the sky and water, looking for any sign of the mysterious lights. Uncle Rob fiddled with various pieces of equipment, an EMF meter, a parabolic microphone, even an old ham radio he'd brought along, just in case. I was starting to get bored and cold, wishing we could just call it a night and head home. That's when it happened. At first, I thought I was seeing things, a faint shimmer on the water's surface, like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. But then it grew brighter, taking on a distinctly blue-green hue. Uncle Rob saw it too. He grabbed my arm, pointing excitedly. "There, do you see it?" he whispered urgently. "It's really happening." The light continued to grow in intensity, pulsing gently. Then, to our amazement, it began to rise up out of the water. It hovered about 10 feet above the surface, casting an eerie glow across the lake. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Suddenly, more lights appeared, red, yellow, white. They danced and swirled around each other in impossible patterns. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spectacle. Uncle Rob was frantically adjusting dials on his camera, trying to capture what we were seeing. "This is incredible," he kept saying. "We're going to be famous." But things were about to get even stranger. The old ham radio Uncle Rob had brought suddenly crackled to life, emitting a series of high-pitched tones and what sounded like garbled voices. We both jumped at the unexpected noise. Uncle Rob grabbed the radio, twisting knobs, trying to clear up the signal. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called into the receiver, but the only response was more of those eerie tones and unintelligible sounds. That's when we felt it, a deep, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The pebbles on the beach began to tremble and dance. The surface of the lake rippled and churned, as if something massive was moving beneath it. I grabbed Uncle Rob's arm, terror overwhelming me. "What's happening?" I cried. He shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," he said hoarsely, "but I think we should—" His words were cut off by an ear-splitting screech that tore through the night. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite mechanical. It made every hair on my body stand on end. And then we saw it, a colossal shape rising up from the center of the lake, blotting out the stars. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the silhouette of something impossibly large, with what looked like tentacles or appendages writhing around it. The lights we'd seen earlier were now swirling around this monstrous form, illuminating bits and pieces of its vast bulk. I caught glimpses of glistening scale-like skin and enormous lidless eyes that seemed to glow from within. Uncle Rob and I stood frozen in horror, unable to move or speak. The thing in the lake let out another bone-shaking roar, and suddenly all sound seemed to vanish from the world. The constant background noise of the forest, insects, birds, wind in the trees, everything went deathly silent. In that moment of absolute quiet, I heard a voice. Not with my ears, but somehow inside my head. It was ancient and alien, speaking words I couldn't understand but that filled me with a profound sense of dread and insignificance. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity began to sink back into the lake. The lights dimmed and faded, and the oppressive silence lifted. Slowly, the normal sounds of the forest returned, an owl hooting in the distance, crickets resuming their nightly chorus. Uncle Rob and I stood there for what felt like hours, shaking and gasping for breath. Finally, without a word, we gathered up our equipment and practically ran back to the truck. We didn't speak the entire drive home. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Uncle Rob's camera had malfunctioned, leaving us with no video evidence. The few photos we managed to take just showed blurry lights that could have been anything. The audio from the ham radio was nothing but static. We never went back to Jasper Hill Park. Uncle Rob eventually moved away, and we gradually lost touch. But I've never forgotten that night. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that unearthly roar and feeling the weight of those ancient alien eyes upon me. I don't know what we encountered that night on the shore of Jasper Lake. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces that defy explanation. And sometimes when we go looking for answers, we find horrors beyond imagination. I've carried this secret for years, afraid that no one would believe me. But I can't keep it inside any longer. This is what happened to me that night at Jasper Hill Park. Make of it what you will. But if you ever find yourself near that lake after dark and you see strange lights on the water, run, and don't look back. My grandparents live at the base of a mountain, and I had always been curious about the old abandoned house at the top that I could see from their backyard. One night, after my grandparents had gone to bed, I decided to sneak out and explore it. It was a full moon, so I figured I'd have enough light to see by. Looking back, I can't believe how stupid and reckless I was. I grabbed a flashlight and started hiking up the overgrown trail leading to the house. The woods were eerily quiet, except for the crunch of leaves under my feet. As I got higher up the mountain, the trees started to thin out, and I could see the silhouette of the old house looming against the night sky. My heart was pounding with anticipation as I approached. The house was bigger than I expected. A crumbling Victorian mansion that must have been grand in its day. Most of the windows were boarded up, but I found a side door that was ajar and slipped inside. The interior was a mess of fallen beams, peeling wallpaper, and decades of dust. I shone my flashlight around, taking in the faded grandeur. Old picture frames hung crookedly on the walls, their contents long rotted away. As I explored the ground floor, I started to get an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in the spooky setting. I found a staircase and made my way up to the second floor. That's when I noticed the tower, a tall, narrow structure jutting up from one corner of the house. Curious, I headed towards it. The entrance to the tower was through a small door that opened onto a spiral staircase. As I climbed the stairs, the air got noticeably colder. When I reached the top, I found myself in a circular room with windows on all sides. In the center was some kind of mechanism, gears and levers that looked like they might have once controlled something. That's when I realized this wasn't just a tower, but an old windmill. I went to one of the windows and looked out. The view was incredible. I could see for miles in the moonlight, the forests and fields stretching out below me. For a moment, I forgot about my uneasiness and just took in the scene. But then I heard it. Footsteps, coming up the tower stairs. At first, I thought I must be imagining things. But no, the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing towards me. I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide, but the room was small and bare. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, hoping whoever it was wouldn't see me in the shadows. The footsteps got louder and louder until they reached the top of the stairs. Then they stopped. I held my breath, willing myself to be as quiet and still as possible. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, ever so slowly, the door began to creak open. In that moment, pure terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. As the door swung wider, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure in the doorway. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow, too tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Before I could process what I was seeing, the figure lunged at me with inhuman speed. I reacted on instinct, swinging my flashlight as hard as I could. It connected with a sickening thud, and the figure stumbled back. But it recovered quickly and came at me again. What followed was the most terrifying fight of my life. The figure was incredibly strong, with arms that seemed to stretch impossibly long as it tried to grab me. I fought with everything I had, kicking and punching and swinging my flashlight wildly. At one point, I managed to duck under its grasp and bolt for the stairs. But as I reached the doorway, long fingers wrapped around my ankle and yanked me back. I crashed to the floor, the wind knocked out of me. As I gasped for air, I saw the figure looming over me. In the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, I caught a glimpse of its face, if you could call it that. It was featureless and smooth, like a blank mask. Filled with a desperate surge of adrenaline, I lashed out with all my strength. My fist connected solidly, and the figure's head snapped back. It stumbled away from me, making an inhuman, keening sound. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I practically fell down the spiral staircase in my haste to get away. I tore through the house and out into the night, not daring to look back. I ran all the way down the mountain, branches whipping my face and roots threatening to trip me at every step. When I finally burst out of the woods near my grandparents' house, I collapsed on the ground, gasping and sobbing. I was covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn. I must have lain there for an hour, too terrified to move. Eventually, I managed to sneak back inside and clean myself up. I told my grandparents I had fallen while going to the bathroom in the night. They fussed over my injuries, but thankfully didn't question my story too much. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Part of me wondered if it had all been some kind of nightmare or hallucination. But my injuries were real, and I knew deep down that the terror I had felt was too visceral to have been imagined. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to go back to the house in the daylight. I made an excuse to my grandparents and hiked up the mountain again. But when I got there, I was shocked to find nothing. The house looked exactly as it had the night before. There was no sign of the struggle in the tower room, no blood, no broken pieces of the mechanism. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times since then, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of ghost or supernatural entity? A hideously deformed person living in the abandoned house? Or did I somehow hallucinate the whole thing? I don't have any answers. All I know is that the fear I felt that night was the most real thing I've ever experienced. I still have nightmares about that faceless figure lunging at me in the dark. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those slow footsteps climbing the stairs towards my room. I never told anyone the full story until now. My grandparents still think I just had a clumsy fall that night. How could I even begin to explain what really happened? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Something impossible and terrifying happened to me that night in that old house on the mountain. And the worst part is not knowing if it's really over, or if someday those footsteps might come for me again. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. I was just a 12-year-old kid living in Atherton, a small town in Queensland, Australia. It was a normal Tuesday morning, and I was waiting at my usual bus stop to go to school. The bus stop was right next to this swampy area. You know, the kind with lots of tall grass and murky water. I never paid much attention to it before. As I stood there, kicking some rocks around and thinking about the math test I had later that day, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a branch or something moving in the wind. But when I looked closer, I froze. There, emerging from the swamp, were these tentacles. Pitch-black tentacles, darker than anything I'd ever seen before. They were just wrong. Like they didn't belong in this world. I blinked hard, thinking I must be seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, they were still there, moving, writhing, reaching out from the murky water. I felt my heart start racing and my palms get sweaty. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The tentacles were massive, easily as thick as my leg, and there were at least 5 or 6 of them that I could see. They moved in this slow, deliberate way that made my skin crawl. And the darkness, it wasn't just black. It was like they were absorbing all the light around them. I'd never seen anything like it. I don't know how long I stood there staring, but suddenly I heard voices. A family was approaching the bus stop, a mom, dad, and 2 little kids. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Surely they'd see these things too, and we could figure out what to do. As they got closer, I turned to them, pointing frantically at the swamp. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Those things in the water." The dad looked where I was pointing, then back at me with a confused expression. "What things, mate? The reeds?" I shook my head vigorously. No, the tentacles. The big black tentacles coming out of the water." The mom exchanged a worried glance with her husband. "Sweetie, there's nothing there but plants and water. Are you feeling all right?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they not see them? The tentacles were right there, clear as day to me. I looked back at the swamp, and they were still there, still moving. I felt panic rising in my chest. Was I going crazy? "But they're right there," I insisted, my voice getting higher. "How can you not see them? They're huge." The little kids were starting to look scared now, hiding behind their mum's legs. The dad put a hand on my shoulder, looking concerned. "Take it easy, mate. There's nothing there. Maybe you're just tired or stressed about school." I shrugged his hand off, feeling frustrated and scared. I knew what I was seeing. It was real. It had to be. But as I looked at their faces, confused, worried, a little freaked out, I realized they genuinely couldn't see what I was seeing. Just then the school bus pulled up. The family got on first, the parents throwing worried glances back at me. I hesitated for a moment, looking back at the swamp. The tentacles were still there, moving slowly, almost beckoning. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly jumped on the bus. All day at school, I couldn't focus. The image of those tentacles kept flashing in my mind. I felt like I was going crazy. How could I have seen something so clearly, so vividly, that no one else could see? I kept replaying the morning over and over in my head, wondering if there was any way I could have imagined it all. When school ended, I dreaded going back to that bus stop. But I also felt a weird need to see if the tentacles were still there. As the bus approached my stop, I felt my heart racing again. I got off, half expecting to see those dark appendages waving at me from the swamp. but there was nothing. Just the usual reeds and murky water. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where I'd seen them that morning. Part of me felt relieved, but another part felt disappointed, confused. I don't know. It was a strange mix of emotions. Over the next few weeks, I went back to that spot many times, at different times of day, hoping, or maybe fearing, that I'd see the tentacles again. But they never reappeared. I even waded into the swamp a bit once, half expecting to feel something grab my leg. But there was nothing. I never told anyone else about what I saw that day. I mean, how could I? Who would believe me? Even now, all these years later, I sometimes wonder if it really happened. But then I remember the vivid details, the way the tentacles moved, the unnatural darkness of them, the feeling of absolute certainty that what I was seeing was real. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it some kind of hallucination? A glitch in reality? Or did I really see something that day that no one else could see? I don't know, but I do know that ever since then, I've never looked at swamps or bodies of water the same way. There's always a part of me that's watching, waiting, wondering if those dark tentacles might appear again. I've tried to research similar experiences, looking for any explanation. I've read about mass hallucinations, about how stress or lack of sleep can make you see things, but nothing quite fits what I experienced. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse. I stared at those tentacles for what felt like minutes. They were as real to me as the ground I was standing on. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that day. What if I had reached out and touched one of those tentacles? What if I had followed them into the swamp? Would I have disappeared, never to be seen again? Or would I have discovered something beyond our understanding of the world? I've never been back to Atherton since we moved away a few years after that incident. Part of me wants to go back, to see that swamp again. But another part of me is terrified of what I might find. Or worse, what I might not find. I know this all sounds crazy. Trust me, I've spent years trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But I can't shake the feeling that what I saw that day was real. That for a brief moment, I glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Something that doesn't belong in our world. So I guess I'm sharing this now because, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe I'm just trying to make sense of it all, even after all these years. Or maybe I'm just hoping that by putting it out there, I'll finally be able to let it go. But deep down, I know I never will. Those tentacles, those impossibly dark, otherworldly tentacles, will always be a part of me now. A reminder that there are things in this world, or maybe beyond it, that we can't explain. And sometimes, for reasons we may never understand, those things choose to reveal themselves to us. So if you're ever in Atherton, or really anywhere near a swamp or body of water, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see. And if you do see something, well, I hope you're not alone like I was. Because believe me, there's nothing scarier than seeing something impossible and having no one believe you. It was supposed to be a normal hunting trip. My girlfriend Melissa and I had been planning it for weeks, a chance to get away from the city and enjoy some time in nature. I'd been hunting in those swamps since I was a kid, so I figured I knew them like the back of my hand. Boy, was I wrong. We arrived early that morning, just as the sun was starting to peek through the cypress trees. The air was thick with humidity, and that distinctive swamp smell filled my nostrils. As we unloaded our gear from the truck, I felt a strange uneasiness wash over me. It was subtle at first, just a vague feeling that something was off. I tried to shake it, chalking it up to lack of sleep or too much coffee. Melissa must have sensed my tension. "You okay, babe?" she asked, touching my arm. I nodded and forced a smile, not wanting to worry her. "Yeah, just eager to get out there," I replied. If only I'd listened to that nagging feeling in my gut. We made our way deeper into the swamp, wading through ankle-deep water and pushing aside hanging moss. The further in we went, the more oppressive the silence became. Usually these swamps were alive with the sounds of birds, frogs, and insects. But that day, it was like nature itself was holding its breath. After about an hour of hiking, we found a good spot to set up our blind. As I was securing the camouflage netting, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a guttural, inhuman shriek that echoed through the trees. Melissa grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I tried to play it cool, but my heart was racing. "Probably just a bobcat or something," I said, not believing my own words. We both knew that sound wasn't made by any normal animal. For the next hour, we sat in tense silence, straining our ears for any sign of danger. Just as I was starting to relax, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. About 50 yards away, something was moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as it emerged into a clearing, I realized how wrong I was. The creature stood on 4 legs like a deer, but that's where the similarities ended. Its body was pale, almost translucent, with skin that looked slimy and unnatural. But it was the head that made my stomach churn. Massive antlers like an elk, but twisted and gnarled in impossible ways. And its face. God, its face. Where eyes should have been, there were just empty, weeping sockets. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking so bad I could barely aim. Melissa was frozen beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I struggled to steady my shot, the thing did something that nearly made me piss myself. It stood up on its hind legs, towering at least 8 feet tall. In that moment, staring into those empty sockets, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. It was like looking into the face of something that shouldn't exist, something that defied the laws of nature. I squeezed the trigger, the sound of the gunshot shattering the eerie silence. I know I hit it. I saw the impact, heard the wet thud of the bullet striking flesh. But the creature didn't flinch. It didn't bleed. It just stood there, its head cocked to the side as if curious. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Not ran away, not faded into the mist, just gone, like it had never been there at all. The only evidence of its existence was the lingering echo of my gunshot and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Melissa and I didn't say a word. We just grabbed our gear and ran, splashing through the swamp in a blind panic. I've never moved so fast in my life, every snapping twig and rustling leaf sending fresh waves of terror through me. When we finally reached the truck, we were both soaked in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled with the keys, cursing as I dropped them in the mud. As I bent to pick them up, I swear I heard that ungodly shriek again, distant but unmistakable. We peeled out of there, tires kicking up mud and gravel. The whole drive home, we barely spoke. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shook the very foundation of what we thought we knew about the world. It's been months since that day, and I still can't shake the memory of that creature. I've tried to rationalize it, swamp gas, a hallucination, anything to make sense of what we saw. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there in the dark places of the world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. I haven't been back to those swamps since, and I doubt I ever will. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman shriek ringing in my ears. Melissa and I don't talk about it much, but I can see the fear in her eyes when the subject comes up. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has seen something similar, that I'm not crazy. Or maybe I just need to get it off my chest, to try and exorcise this memory that's been haunting me. All I know is that the world is a stranger and more terrifying place than I ever imagined, and I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. So if you're ever in the Georgia swamps and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or see something moving in the shadows that doesn't look quite natural, don't stick around to investigate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because there are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand, and some encounters you can never truly recover from. I still get chills thinking about that summer day when I was 12. It was supposed to be just another lazy afternoon at the lake near our reservation in Washington, but it turned into something I'll never forget. The day started off normal enough. My parents were arguing again about money troubles, and I was trying to tune them out while doing my chores. I remember feeling annoyed that I had to sweep the porch and do dishes when all I wanted was to go swimming. It was scorching hot, and the cool water of the lake was calling my name. Finally, after what felt like forever, my mom said we could head down to the lake. I practically sprinted to my room to change into my swimsuit. My little brother Tommy was whining that he didn't want to go, but I didn't care. I was out the door before anyone could change their mind. The lake was beautiful that day, crystal clear and shimmering in the sunlight. A light breeze rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of sap and wildflowers. It was the perfect summer day. I waded in eagerly, relishing the cold shock against my sun-warmed skin. My parents settled on the shore with Tommy, who was scared of the water. I struck out on my own, swimming further and further from the beach. The water felt amazing. I floated on my back, staring up at the cloudless blue sky and letting all my worries drift away. I don't know how long I floated there, lost in my own world. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my leg. I jerked upright, treading water and looking around. There was nothing there that I could see, just smooth, dark water stretching in every direction. I figured it must have been a fish or some lake weeds. Still, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The lake seemed different somehow, colder, darker. I turned to swim back to shore. That's when it happened. A hand, ice cold and slimy, clamped around my ankle and yanked me under. Panic exploded through me as I was dragged down into the murky depths. I thrashed and kicked, trying desperately to break free, but the grip was like iron. My lungs burned for air as I sank deeper and deeper. In the greenish gloom, I caught a glimpse of whatever had me. It wasn't human. The hand gripping my leg was webbed with wickedly sharp claws digging into my flesh. I couldn't make out the rest of it in the murky water, just a vague, dark shape. Terror, unlike anything I'd ever known, consumed me. This was how I was going to die, dragged to the bottom of the lake by some kind of monster. As my vision started to go dark from lack of oxygen, survival instinct kicked in. I twisted around and clawed at the thing's hand, raking my nails across its slippery flesh. To my shock, it let go. I shot to the surface, gasping and choking. Without thinking, I swam for shore as fast as I could, expecting at any moment to feel those icy fingers wrap around my leg again. Somehow, I made it. I dragged myself onto the beach, coughing up lake water and shaking uncontrollably. My family rushed over, asking what happened. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. When I finally caught my breath, I tried to explain through my tears, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. My dad waded out into the water, peering into the depths. But of course there was nothing to see. They didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded insane, some kind of lake monster trying to drown me. They assumed I had gotten a leg cramp and panicked. But I knew what I felt, what I saw. The ice-cold grip, those inhuman claws, that dark shape in the water. It was real. For weeks after, I had terrible nightmares. I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling phantom hands dragging me down into blackness. I refused to go near the lake or any body of water deeper than a bathtub. My parents eventually took me to a therapist, thinking I was traumatized from nearly drowning. I stopped trying to convince anyone of what really happened, but I've never forgotten. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is lurking beneath the surface of that lake. Something ancient and malevolent that doesn't belong in our world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting. I've tried researching local legends, looking for any similar stories. The closest I've found are old tribal tales of water spirits and monsters that drag people to watery graves. But those are just myths, right? All I know is what happened to me that day was very, very real, and it's made me view the natural world in a whole new light. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking in dark places. I'm 25 now, and I still haven't been back to that lake. Just thinking about it makes my heart race and my palms sweat. Will I ever know for sure what grabbed me that day? Probably not. But the memory of those icy fingers and knife-like claws will stay with me forever. Sometimes I catch myself staring at lakes and rivers, wondering what might be hiding beneath the surface. Other times, I wake up in a cold sweat, phantom sensations of being dragged down into darkness lingering from my dreams. I've mostly come to terms with what happened, or at least I've learned to live with the uncertainty and fear. But a part of me will always be that terrified 12-year-old girl fighting for her life in the murky depths of the lake. If you're ever swimming in a lake or river and you feel something brush against your leg, don't assume it's just a fish or some weeds. It might be something much, much worse, something waiting to pull you down into the darkness where no one can hear you scream. I count myself lucky to have escaped. Others might not be so fortunate. So be careful out there and always remember, just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. Watching, waiting, ready to strike when you least expect it. That summer day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to a world beyond what we can see and understand. A world where ancient, terrifying things still exist in the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never take the safety of dry land for granted again, and neither should you. Looking back, I can't believe how reckless I was, but at the time, it seemed thrilling, sneaking out after midnight, armed with just my phone flashlight and a pocket knife. The woods were pitch black and eerily quiet as I made my way deeper in. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves under my feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. At first, I felt a rush of excitement. This was way more interesting than sitting at home watching Netflix. But as I got further from the trail, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my flashlight beam. I told myself I was being silly, that there was nothing to be afraid of. How wrong I was. I'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when I heard it. A low, guttural sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a growl, but more human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. I was about to turn back when movement caught my eye. Something pale flitted between two trees about 20 feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I aimed the light in that direction. For a split second, I saw it. A humanoid figure, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its body emaciated. The skin was a sickly grayish white, stretched tight over protruding bones. But the worst part was its face, if you could even call it that. Where eyes should have been, there were just black, empty sockets that seemed to absorb the light from my phone. I screamed and stumbled backwards, nearly dropping my phone. The thing let out that horrible growl again and started moving towards me with unnatural speed. Pure terror flooded my body. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I fled blindly through the woods. I could hear it behind me, that inhuman growling getting closer. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but raw fear kept me going. I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead me out of the woods. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. To my shock, there was a raggedy tent set up near some bushes. A homeless man was sitting by a tiny campfire, looking startled by my sudden appearance. "Help me," I gasped out between ragged breaths. "There's something chasing me." The man jumped to his feet, grabbing a thick branch from his fire. "Get behind me, kid," he said gruffly. I didn't need to be told twice. I darted behind him just as that horrifying creature burst into the clearing. The homeless man's eyes went wide with shock, but to his credit, he held his ground. "What in God's name?" he muttered. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek that made my blood run cold. It lunged forward with shocking speed. The homeless man swung his burning branch, catching the thing across what passed for its face. It recoiled with an unearthly howl of pain. "Run!" the man yelled at me. "I'll hold it off." Part of me wanted to stay and help him, but terror won out. I took off running again, the sounds of struggle fading behind me. Guilt and fear warred in my chest as I fled. What was that thing? What would happen to the homeless man who'd saved me? I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed to the forest floor, gasping for air. As I lay there trying to catch my breath, the woods around me were deathly silent. No growls or shrieks, no sounds of pursuit. Had I lost it? After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I struggled to my feet. My whole body ached, and I was covered in cuts and scratches from my mad dash through the woods. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I had to get out of there. I picked a direction and started walking, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. The sky was starting to lighten as dawn approached. Just when I was starting to lose hope of ever finding my way out, I spotted lights through the trees. Relief flooded through me as I emerged from the woods onto a residential street. I made it home just as the sun was coming up. My parents were still asleep, oblivious to my nighttime adventure. I showered and crawled into bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face, those black, soulless eyes boring into me. For weeks afterwards, I was plagued by nightmares. I couldn't bring myself to go near the woods. I scoured local news sites, dreading that I'd see a story about a dead homeless man found in the forest. But there was nothing. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of sneaking out and getting lost in the woods caused me to hallucinate. But then I remember the raw terror I felt, the inhuman sounds that creature made, the way its skin stretched over its bones, how unnaturally it moved. It was real. I know it was real. It's been 2 years now, and I still get chills thinking about that night. I've tried to research what I saw, but nothing quite fits. The closest thing I've found are stories of ghouls from Middle Eastern folklore, corpse-eating creatures that haunt graveyards and lonely places. But those are just myths, right? I don't go into the woods at night anymore. During the day, when the sun is high and there are other people around, it's not so bad. But as soon as dusk starts to fall, that creeping dread comes back. I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the shadows between the trees, that thing is still lurking, waiting. Sometimes I think about that homeless man who saved me. Did he survive? Did he see what I saw? Does he lie awake at night, haunted by memories of a creature that shouldn't exist? Or did he dismiss it as a bad dream brought on by whatever he'd been drinking that night? I'll probably never know what really happened. Part of me doesn't want to know, but another part can't let it go. I find myself drawn to stories of cryptids and unexplained phenomena, always searching for something that matches what I saw. So far, I've come up empty. All I know for sure is that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the darkness, just beyond the edge of what we understand. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you catch a glimpse of them. I just hope I never see that thing again. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, our paths will cross again. And next time, there might not be anyone around to save me. It was a typical hot summer night in Abilene, Texas. Me and my friends, Jake, Megan, and Chris, were bored out of our minds. We'd spent most of the evening hanging out in the Walmart parking lot, but even that got old after a while. As we were about to call it a night, Jake had the bright idea to go explore the creek behind the supermarket. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," he said with a mischievous grin. We were all 16 and invincible, so of course we agreed. What could go wrong? We grabbed our phones for light and headed towards the wooded area behind the store. The creek was more like a muddy trickle in the summer heat, but the trees provided some relief from the stuffy night air. We laughed and joked as we picked our way along the creek bed, our shoes squelching in the mud. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came to a small clearing. That's when things took a turn I'll never forget. Chris was shining his phone light around when he suddenly froze. "Guys, what's that over there?" he whispered, pointing to the base of a large oak tree about 20 feet away. We all turned to look. At first I couldn't make out what he was talking about. Then I saw it, a pale shape huddled at the base of the tree. It looked like a person crouching down, but something was off about it. The proportions weren't quite right. "Hello?" Jake called out hesitantly. No response. My heart was starting to race. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Megan took a few steps closer, her phone light trained on the figure. "Are you okay? Do you need he—" Her words cut off in a strangled gasp as the thing suddenly moved. It uncurled itself and stood up, and up, and up. Oh God, it was so tall. At least 8 feet, maybe more. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, like someone had taken a normal human and stretched them out like taffy. The skin was a sickly grayish-white color that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But the worst part was the face. It was vaguely human-shaped, but wrong in a way I can't fully describe. The features were sunken and distorted, and the eyes, huge yellow orbs that reflected our light like a cat's. They locked onto us with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. For a split second, we all just stood there frozen in shock and terror. Then Megan screamed, and all hell broke loose. The creature's head snapped towards her, and it let out a sound I'll never forget, a high-pitched shriek that was somewhere between a bird call and nails on a chalkboard. Then it started moving towards us with terrifying speed, covering ground in huge, loping strides. We ran. Oh God, did we run. I've never moved so fast in my life. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we desperately tried to get away from that thing. I could hear it behind us, that awful shrieking punctuated by the sound of snapping branches as it pursued us through the woods. I was certain at any moment I'd feel those long skeletal fingers grabbing me. Somehow we made it back to the parking lot. We didn't stop running until we reached Jake's car, piling in and locking the doors as he peeled out of there. We drove in panicked silence for several minutes, all of us trying to process what we'd just seen. Finally, Chris spoke up in a shaky voice. What the hell was that thing? Nobody had an answer. We spent the rest of the night huddled at my house, jumping at every little sound and trying to convince ourselves it had all been some shared hallucination. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it's still out there somewhere. I haven't been back to those woods since that night. I can't bring myself to go anywhere near that area after dark. My friends and I don't really talk about what happened. I think we're all trying to forget. But I can't forget those glowing yellow eyes or that horrifying shriek. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that sound again. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. Some kind of mutant? An escaped experiment? A monster from another dimension? I have no idea, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that there are things out there in the dark that defy explanation. Things that shouldn't exist, but do. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might catch a glimpse of them. I used to love exploring and adventuring at night. Now I can barely bring myself to take the trash out after sunset. That encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, looking for any hint of movement. Every rustle of leaves makes me flinch. I've become hyper-aware of how vulnerable we really are, how thin the veil is between our safe, normal world and whatever else is out there. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid nightmare. But then I'll catch a glimpse of the scratches on my arms from crashing through the bushes that night. Or I'll see the haunted look in my friend's eyes when someone mentions going for a night hike, and I know it was all too real. I've done some research since then, trying to find any similar encounters or explanations for what we saw. I found a few vague stories about tall, pale humanoids in the woods, but nothing quite matches our experience. Part of me wants answers, wants to understand what that thing was and why it was there. But a bigger part of me is terrified of learning more. What if understanding attracts its attention somehow? What if there are more of them out there? I know this all probably sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a few months ago, I would have laughed it off as an urban legend or a campfire tale. But I swear on everything I hold dear, this really happened. So let this be a warning. Be careful when you go exploring at night. Stick to well-lit areas. And if you're out in the woods and you hear something that sounds like a bird, but not quite, run. Run as fast as you can. And don't look back, because there are things out there in the darkness, things that shouldn't exist. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. They'll haunt your dreams and lurk in the shadows of your mind forever. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night. The world feels different now, darker and more dangerous. But I'm sharing this story in the hopes that it might help someone else avoid a similar encounter. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the monsters are real. I still remember that hunting trip like it was yesterday, even though it's been 5 years now. My dad and I had been planning it for months, our annual father-son bonding time in the woods. We'd done it every year since I was old enough to handle a rifle, but this time felt different from the start. We drove out to our usual spot deep in the national forest, about a 4-hour drive from home. The whole way there, I had this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake it off as just nerves or excitement, but something felt off. When we got to our campsite and started unloading the truck, I noticed my dad seemed on edge too. He kept glancing around at the trees, like he was expecting something to jump out at us. I asked if everything was okay, and he just grunted fine in that gruff way of his. Classic dad, never wanting to admit when something's bothering him. We set up camp and got a fire going as the sun started to set. Sitting there eating our camp stove chili, I tried to relax and get into the familiar rhythm of our trips, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked toward the darkening tree line, I swore I saw shadows moving just out of sight. "You see something out there?" my dad asked, following my gaze. I shook my head. "Nah, just jumpy, I guess. Been in the city too long." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. We turned in early that night, wanting to get an early start in the morning. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to fall asleep. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf had me on high alert. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, calling my name. "Jack, Jack, come here, my love." My eyes shot open and I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag. That was impossible. It sounded exactly like my girlfriend Amy's voice. But Amy was hundreds of miles away back home. "Dad," I whispered urgently. "Dad, did you hear that?" He grumbled and rolled over. "Hear what? Go to sleep. We've got an early start." I laid back down, heart racing. It must have been a dream, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks. But I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. The next morning, we set out at first light. My dad could tell something was off with me, but he didn't pry. We hiked for a couple hours to our usual hunting spot, taking up positions on opposite sides of a small clearing. The day dragged on with no sign of deer. My nerves were shot from lack of sleep, and every sound had me jumping. More than once I whirled around, certain I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision, but there was never anything there. As the afternoon wore on, I heard it again. Amy's voice, clear as day, coming from the woods behind me. "Jack, where are you? I've been looking all over for you, my love." I spun around, rifle at the ready. "Amy," I called out. "Amy, is that you?" But there was no response, just the usual forest sounds. I was about to radio my dad when his gruff voice came through the walkie-talkie. "Jack, you okay over there? Thought I heard you yelling." "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. "Just thought I heard something." "Well, keep it down. You'll scare off all the game," he growled back. I tried to refocus, but I was seriously rattled now. I knew there was no way Amy could be out here, but that voice, it was unmistakable. What the hell was going on? As the sun started to dip below the tree line, I heard rustling in the underbrush nearby. Finally, I thought. A deer. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, but what emerged from the bushes wasn't a deer. It was a person, or at least it looked like a person. But something was wrong. The proportions were off, limbs too long and head too small, and the way it moved was all wrong, jerky and unnatural. I blinked hard, certain I must be hallucinating from exhaustion. When I looked again, it was gone. Just empty forest where it had been standing. My hands were shaking as I keyed the radio. "Dad?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad? I think we should call it a day. Head back to camp." There was a long pause before he responded. Yeah, I think you're right, son. Meet you back at the clearing in 10. The walk back to our meeting spot was the longest of my life. Every shadow looked like a person. Every breeze sounded like whispers. I kept seeing flashes of movement just at the edge of my vision. When I finally reached the clearing, my dad was already there. One look at his face told me he'd experienced something too. His usual stoic expression was gone, replaced by wide eyes and a nervous twitch. "Let's get the hell out of here," was all he said. We practically ran back to our campsite, not even bothering to properly break down our gear. We just threw everything in the truck haphazardly and peeled out of there, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As we sped down the old logging road, I heard Amy's voice one last time. This time it came from right beside me in the truck cab. "Jack, why are you leaving? Don't you want to stay with me forever?" I yelled and swerved, nearly running us off the road. My dad grabbed the wheel, steadying us. "What the hell, son?" he shouted. Did you hear that?" I asked, voice shaking. He just looked at me, fear evident in his eyes. I didn't hear anything, but I saw things in the woods, things that shouldn't exist. We drove in silence after that, both lost in our own terrifying thoughts. When we finally got home late that night, we went our separate ways without another word. We've never spoken about what happened on that trip, never gone hunting together again. I still don't know what to make of it all. Was it mass hallucination? Some kind of shared psychosis brought on by isolation in the woods? Or did we stumble into something truly supernatural out there? All I know is I'll never set foot in those woods again. And to this day, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear Amy's voice calling me from the darkness, calling me to come back, to stay forever in those nightmare-filled woods. I still remember that day on the farm like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a decade now. I was 17 at the time, working on my parents' farm during summer break. It was a scorching hot afternoon in July, and I was out in the garden pulling weeds and tending to the vegetables. Sweat was dripping down my face as I knelt in the dirt, yanking stubborn dandelions out by their roots. That's when I first noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up and saw movement at the edge of the woods that bordered our property. At first I thought it was just a deer, or maybe one of our horses that had gotten loose. But as I squinted against the bright sunlight, I realized it was much bigger than a deer. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the sleek, tawny shape of a mountain lion slinking along the tree line. We'd had problems with cougars preying on our livestock before, but I'd never seen one this close to the house in broad daylight. I froze, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might provoke it. The big cat paused at the edge of the field, its tail twitching as it surveyed the area. Even from 50 yards away, I could see its powerful muscles rippling under its hide. My mind raced as I tried to remember what you're supposed to do if you encounter a mountain lion. Make yourself look big, back away slowly, play dead. Before I could decide on a course of action, something else emerged from the shadows of the forest. At first I couldn't quite make out what it was, just a pale, emaciated shape creeping on all fours. As it came fully into view, I felt my blood run cold. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but definitely not human. Its limbs were too long and spindly, joints bending at unnatural angles. The thing's skin was a sickly grayish-white color, stretched taut over its bony frame. But the face was the worst part. Just empty black sockets where the eyes should be, and a wide, lipless mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something. But I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the nightmarish scene unfolding before me. The creature stalked towards the mountain lion with unnatural speed and grace. The big cat's ears flattened against its head, and it let out a warning growl, but it was too late. In a blur of movement too fast for my eyes to follow, the pale thing pounced. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a spray of blood as its jaws clamped down on the cougar's neck. The mountain lion thrashed and clawed desperately, but it was no match for the creature's strength. In seconds, the cougar went limp. I watched in horror as the thing began to feed, tearing into the carcass with its razor-sharp claws and teeth. Dark blood stained its pale skin as it gorged itself on the fresh kill. I felt bile rising in my throat and finally managed to tear my gaze away, squeezing my eyes shut. When I looked back a few moments later, both the creature and the mountain lion's body were gone without a trace. There was no blood on the grass, no sign that anything had happened at all. If it weren't for the lingering metallic scent of blood in the air, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me. I had to tell someone what I'd seen. My parents would know what to do. They'd call the police or animal control or someone who could deal with this. I started running towards the house, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard my dad's voice calling my name. "Joey, Joey, where are you?" It was coming from the direction of the barn. Relief flooded through me. Dad must have come out to check on me and seen what happened. I changed course and sprinted towards the barn instead. "Dad, Dad, I'm here," I shouted as I ran. "There was a mountain lion, and this thing attacked it. We need to call someone." But as I got closer to the barn, I realized something was wrong. The voice calling my name didn't sound quite right. It was my dad's voice, but there was a strange, echoing quality to it, like it was coming from the bottom of a well, and it kept repeating the same phrases over and over with the exact same intonation each time. I skidded to a stop about 20 feet from the barn doors. They were shut tight, and I couldn't see any sign of my father. The voice continued to call out, but now I could tell it wasn't coming from inside the barn at all. It seemed to be coming from all around me, with no clear source. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly backed away. This wasn't my dad. This was something else using his voice to lure me in. I turned and ran back towards the house as fast as my legs could carry me, the strange calls fading behind me. I burst through the kitchen door, gasping for breath. My mom looked up from where she was preparing dinner, alarm crossing her face when she saw my panicked state. "Joey, what's wrong? What happened?" she asked, hurrying over to me. I tried to explain what I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. Mom listened with growing concern, then picked up the phone to call my dad. He answered right away. He'd been in town picking up supplies and was on his way home. When Dad got back, I had to go through the whole story again. They both looked skeptical, especially when we went out to check the spot where I'd seen the attack happen and found no trace of blood or struggle. Dad said the creature I saw was probably just a coyote or a feral dog that had gotten into a fight with the mountain lion. He insisted the weird calls I heard were just the wind playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe their rational explanations, but I knew deep down that what I'd seen was real. In the days that followed, I jumped at every shadow and strange sound. I refused to go near the woods alone. My parents started to worry about me, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear about stress and overactive imaginations. But I know what I saw that day. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that pale, eyeless face burned into my mind. I've never seen the creature again, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Every time I hear an odd noise or glimpse movement in my peripheral vision, my heart starts racing. I'm 28 now, with a family of my own. We live in the city, far away from that farm and those woods. But a part of me is always on alert, always waiting for that thing to show up again. I don't know what it was or where it came from. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying, and I hope I never encounter anything like it ever again. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there who have seen similar things, creatures that shouldn't exist, that defy explanation. But I'm afraid to dig too deeply into it. What if looking for answers only draws their attention? So I keep my experience to myself, trying to move on with my life while always keeping one eye on the shadows. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that summer day on the farm, and I'll never forget the bone-deep terror I felt as I watched that pale monstrosity tear apart a mountain lion like it was made of paper. Some things once seen can never be unseen, and some memories, no matter how much you might want to, can never truly be forgotten. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. My buddy Jake and I had decided to go fishing at Blackwater Lake, a secluded spot about an hour's drive from town. We'd heard rumors that the lake was haunted, but we laughed it off. I mean, who actually believes in ghosts these days? We arrived just before dawn, hoping to catch the early morning bite. As we unloaded our gear from Jake's old pickup, I noticed an eerie stillness in the air. The usual sounds of birds and insects were strangely absent. A thick fog hung over the water, obscuring the far shore. "Damn, that's some creepy-ass fog," Jake muttered as we dragged our small aluminum boat to the water's edge. I nodded in agreement, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warm summer air. Something about this place just felt wrong. But I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to lack of sleep and too much coffee. We pushed off from shore and started paddling out into the misty lake. The water was unusually still, like glass. Our oars barely made a ripple as we glided silently through the fog. After about 15 minutes, we found a promising spot and dropped anchor. Jake baited his hook and cast his line with a soft plop. I followed suit, the familiar motions helping to ease my lingering unease. We fished in silence for a while, the fog muffling any sounds from shore. I was just starting to relax when Jake suddenly grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Dude, what the hell is that?" he whispered, pointing out across the water. I squinted into the mist, straining to see what had spooked him. At first I saw nothing but gray fog. Then, about 50 yards away, I noticed a dark shape slowly emerging from the water. My blood ran cold as the figure rose higher, taking on a vaguely human form. But there was something horribly wrong with its proportions. The arms were too long, the torso twisted at an impossible angle. As it continued to rise from the depths, I could make out more horrifying details. The skin was a sickly grayish green, hanging in loose, waterlogged folds. Tangled weeds and lake detritus clung to the creature's emaciated form. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed an intense, bloody red in its misshapen face, fixed directly on our boat with predatory focus. Oh fuck, Jake was muttering beside me, his whole body shaking. We gotta get out of here, man. I wanted to agree, to start paddling for shore as fast as we could, but I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the nightmarish apparition. The creature let out a gurgling moan that echoed across the still water. Then, with shocking speed, it began moving towards our boat. It didn't swim, but seemed to glide just under the surface, creating barely a ripple. That finally snapped me out of my trance. "Go! Paddle!" I yelled at Jake, grabbing an oar and plunging it into the water. We paddled frantically, our movements panicked and uncoordinated. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the thing gaining on us rapidly, those glowing red eyes growing larger by the second. "Faster!" Jake screamed. "It's right behind us!" I redoubled my efforts, my arms burning with exertion. We were maybe 20 yards from shore now, but the creature was practically on top of us. I felt icy fingers brush against my back and let out a terrified yelp. Jake's face had gone chalk white, his eyes bulging as he stared at something just over my shoulder. With a final burst of desperate strength, we surged forward, and the bottom of the boat scraped against the rocky shore. We leapt out, splashing through the shallows and scrambling up onto dry land. I fully expected to feel those cold, dead hands grabbing at my legs. But when we turned back to look, there was nothing, just our little boat bobbing gently in the water, and beyond that, the empty, fog-shrouded lake. Jake and I stood there panting for several minutes, scanning the water for any sign of the horrific creature, but there was no trace of it. What the fuck was that thing?" Jake finally whispered. I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd just experienced. "I don't know, man. I really don't know." We quickly packed up our gear and got the hell out of there, not saying much on the drive home. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of shared hallucination or trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what we'd seen was all too real. It's been 5 years since that day, and I've never gone back to Blackwater Lake. Jake and I don't talk about what happened anymore, but sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, those glowing red eyes haunting my dreams. I don't know what that thing in the lake was, some kind of ghost, demon, or something else entirely. But I do know that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in dark waters and lonely places, waiting for unsuspecting victims. So if you're ever fishing on a foggy lake and see something strange in the water, don't wait around to get a better look. Paddle for shore as fast as you can and pray to God it doesn't follow you. I never thought I'd stumble upon something so terrifying and unexplainable in my own backyard. It was early April 2020, right when the COVID pandemic was really ramping up. Everything was shut down, people were panicking, and an eerie quiet had settled over my small town of York, Pennsylvania. With nothing else to do, I decided to go for a hike in the woods near my house. I'd explored those trails countless times before, but that day felt different. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive. The usual birdsong was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. I veered off the main path, wanting to check out a secluded area I'd never fully explored. As I pushed through the dense underbrush, the air grew thick and heavy. A strange smell hit me. Acrid smoke mixed with something metallic and rotten. My heart started racing as I stumbled into a small clearing. What I saw there still haunts me to this day. In the center was a crude stone altar, maybe 3 feet high. Arranged on top were red and black candles, still smoking slightly. Scattered among them were small animal bones and feathers. But the worst part was the huge pentagram carved into the ground in front of the altar. It looked fresh, the dirt still damp and dark. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Who would build something like this out here? And why? Suddenly, I heard chanting in the distance. Panicked, I dove behind a large fallen tree, peering out between the branches. 11 hooded figures emerged from the trees, moving in unison toward the altar. Their robes were deep crimson, faces completely obscured. They formed a circle around the pentagram and began to chant louder. I couldn't make out most of it, but it sounded like German. A few words jumped out at me. Böse, evil, Flamme, flame, Teufel, devil. My blood ran cold as I realized I was witnessing some kind of satanic ritual. The chanting reached a fever pitch. One of the figures produced a knife, holding it high. I squeezed my eyes shut, terrified of what might happen next. But then, abruptly, everything went silent. When I looked again, the clearing was empty. No hooded figures, no knife. But the altar and pentagram remained. I ran home as fast as I could, my mind reeling. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a weird stress response to the pandemic. But I knew deep down it had been real. I tossed and turned all night, unable to shake the image of those robed figures from my mind. The next morning, against my better judgment, I went back. I had to know if it had really happened. As I approached the clearing, my stomach dropped. The altar was still there, but now there were 12 robes draped over it, 11 red and 1 black. An inverted crucifix had been added, hanging above the altar. The pentagram looked freshly carved again, with strange symbols etched around the edges. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. I snapped a few pictures with shaking hands before getting the hell out of there. I debated showing them to the police, but who would believe me? And what if those people found out I'd seen them? For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I could hear chanting outside my window. Shadows in the corner of my eye seemed to form hooded shapes. I started having vivid nightmares about blood-soaked altars and demons speaking in guttural German. I avoided the woods entirely after that, too scared of what I might find. But sometimes at night, I'd see a faint red glow coming from that direction. And on particularly still evenings, I swear I could hear the faintest whisper of chanting on the wind. As the pandemic dragged on, more strange things started happening around town. Pets went missing. Weird symbols appeared spray-painted on buildings overnight. There were rumors of people in robes being spotted in back alleys and empty lots. I became obsessed with researching occult activity in the area. I discovered that York has a long history of witchcraft allegations, going back to the 1700s. There were stories of secret pagan groups operating in the region for centuries. Some of the local German families had roots tracing back to medieval mystic societies. I started to wonder if what I'd seen was part of some ancient tradition, kept alive in secret all these years. The more I dug, the more paranoid I became. I started noticing odd symbols hidden in plain sight around town, on old buildings, worked into wrought iron fences, even in the tilework of the post office floor. Had this been going on right under our noses this whole time? I tried talking to a few trusted friends about what I'd seen, but they all brushed it off. They said I was letting my imagination run wild due to pandemic stress. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just below the surface of our quiet town. As the months wore on, my fear slowly morphed into a morbid fascination. I'd catch myself walking near the woods at dusk, straining to hear chanting. I pored over books on the occult, learning about ritual magic and demon summoning. Part of me wanted to go back to that clearing, to see what else I might discover. But a deeper, primal part of my brain screamed at me to stay away. Whatever was happening there, it was dark and dangerous. I was lucky to have escaped unnoticed that first time. It's been over 2 years now since that day in the woods. The pandemic has eased, and life has largely returned to normal. But I'm forever changed by what I witnessed. I still have nightmares about hooded figures and blood-drenched altars. Every time I hear German being spoken, my heart races. I've never gone back to that specific spot in the woods. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch a whiff of that same acrid metallic smell. And I know that whatever malevolent force I stumbled upon that day is still out there, waiting in the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I saw that day or what it means for our town. But I do know that there are dark things in this world that most people never see. And once you've glimpsed them, you can never go back to the blissful ignorance of before. So if you're ever hiking in the woods around York, Pennsylvania, be careful where you wander. And if you hear chanting on the wind or smell something burning, turn back immediately. Some mysteries are better left undiscovered. My first groggy thought was that it must be one of those stupid cannon blasts they sometimes do at the high school football games. But as I became more alert, I realized this was way too powerful to be anything like that. This was on a whole other level. Heart pounding, I scrambled out of bed and ran to the window, fully expecting to see some kind of explosion or disaster outside. But when I looked out, everything seemed eerily normal and quiet. No signs of damage, no emergency vehicles, nothing out of the ordinary at all. Just the dark, still night. I stood there for several minutes, straining my eyes and ears for any clue about what could have caused that earth-shaking boom. Part of me wondered if I had dreamed it, but I knew it had been too real and intense for that. Plus, I could see lights flicking on in some of the neighbors' houses, so clearly others had heard it too. Eventually, my parents came to check on me. They had been woken up by it as well and were just as confused as I was. We turned on the local news, hoping for some explanation, but there was nothing. No reports of explosions, no weather phenomena, absolutely zilch. The next morning, it was all anyone in the neighborhood could talk about. Some people thought it might have been a meteor strike or something, but there was no evidence of impact anywhere. Others suggested it could have been a supersonic aircraft, but the Air Force denied any operations in our area. It was like this massive sonic event had come out of nowhere and vanished without a trace. I spent that whole day obsessively searching online for any information, theories, or similar incidents. I found a few forum threads where people were discussing it, but no one seemed to have any real answers. It was driving me crazy not knowing what had happened. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept replaying the sound in my head and imagining all sorts of wild scenarios. What if it happened again? What if it was aliens or some kind of government experiment? My mind was racing with possibilities. The next day passed uneventfully, but I remained on edge. I kept expecting to hear more about it on the news or for some official explanation to come out. But it was like everyone had just shrugged it off and moved on. How could people not be more freaked out by this? As night fell again, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the sky. I don't know what I was looking for exactly, but I just had this feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about to give up my sky-watching vigil when a bright light caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a plane, but then I realized it was moving way too fast. It was like a glowing sphere, brilliantly white with a slight bluish tinge, and it was descending rapidly from the sky. I only saw it for a split second before it vanished behind some trees. But in that instant, my blood ran cold. This wasn't some airplane or shooting star. This was something else entirely. Before I could even process what I'd seen, there was another deafening boom. It wasn't quite as loud as the first one 2 nights ago, but it was definitely the same kind of sound. I felt it resonate through my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I ran downstairs, shouting for my parents. They came running, alarmed by the panic in my voice. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I was talking so fast and frantically that I'm not sure how much sense I was making. We went outside, joined by several neighbors who had also heard the sound. Everyone was looking around, searching for some sign of what had happened. But just like before, there was nothing to see. No crater, no wreckage, no strange objects. It was as if the light and the sound had simply appeared and disappeared without leaving any trace. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with trying to figure out what was going on. I scoured the internet for similar reports, reaching out to people on forums and social media who claimed to have experienced unexplained booms or seen strange lights. I even tried contacting local astronomers and meteorologists, but none of them could offer any satisfying explanations. My parents started to get worried about how fixated I was becoming. They tried to convince me that it was probably just some natural phenomenon we didn't understand, or maybe some kind of secret military test. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than that. I started having trouble sleeping, staying up late to watch the sky. Every little sound made me jump, thinking it might be another boom. I became hyper-aware of every aircraft that passed overhead, every flash of light in the distance. It was like my whole world had shrunk down to this one mystery. As the days turned into weeks and then months, with no further incidents, I slowly began to accept that I might never know what really happened. The memory of those 2 nights still gives me chills, and I can't help but scan the sky sometimes, wondering if I'll ever see that strange sphere of light again. To this day, I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what I experienced. Was it some kind of natural phenomenon we don't understand? A secret government project? Or something even more inexplicable? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know that those events changed me. They opened my eyes to the fact that there are things in this world that defy easy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly understand about the universe around us. Sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I find myself listening, waiting. Part of me hopes I'll never hear that sound again, but another part wonders what might happen if I do, because whatever it was, whatever caused those earth-shaking booms and that impossible light, it felt like the beginning of something, like a door opening to a reality I never knew existed. And as terrifying as it was, there's a part of me that can't help but be curious about what might be on the other side of that door. But for now, all I can do is remember, wonder, and keep my eyes on the sky. Because if there's one thing I learned from those strange summer nights, it's that the most extraordinary things can happen when you least expect them. And sometimes, the universe has a way of reminding us just how small and unknowing we really are. I arrived at my usual spot just before sunset, eager to catch some fish for dinner. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. As I set up my gear, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no rustling in the bushes. It was eerily still, but I brushed it off, focused on the task at hand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cast my line into the dark water. The twilight cast long shadows across the river, and a thin mist began to rise from the surface. I should have known then that something was off, but I was too caught up in the moment. Hours passed, and I hadn't caught a single fish. Frustrated, I decided to give it one more try before packing up. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees behind me. I turned, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just a raccoon, I thought. But then I smelled it, a strong metallic odor that made my stomach turn. It was like copper, and something else, something rotten. My heart started racing as I realized this wasn't any animal I knew. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I pointed it towards the tree line. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but shadows. But as I swept it back and forth, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Two glowing eyes, like burning embers, staring right at me from the darkness. I froze, unable to move or breathe. The eyes blinked slowly, and I saw a figure begin to emerge from the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its pale skin stretched tight over its frame. As it stepped into the light, I saw its face, if you could call it that. It was featureless, save for those glowing eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch from ear to ear, filled with jagged teeth. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I scrambled to gather my things. But in my panic, I knocked over my tackle box, spilling its contents across the ground. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, and it let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I abandoned my gear and ran. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. The smell of copper and death grew stronger, and I knew it was gaining on me. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at my face and arms. In my terror, I had no idea where I was going. The trees all looked the same in the darkness, and I realized with growing dread that I was lost. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, and I knew I couldn't outrun it much longer. That's when I remembered the flare gun in my backpack. I always carried it for emergencies, never thinking I'd actually need to use it. With trembling hands, I reached into my bag as I ran, praying I could find it before the creature caught up to me. My fingers closed around the cold metal just as I felt something brush against my back. Without thinking, I spun around and fired the flare directly at the creature's face. The forest lit up in a blinding red glow as the flare exploded. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek that made me cover my ears in pain. When I looked up, it was gone, leaving behind only that sickening copper smell. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the forest floor, gasping for air. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally found my way back to my car. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. What was that thing? How long had it been out there, stalking the forests? And most terrifyingly, would it come back for me? It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination, some trick of the light and shadows. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I haven't been back to the Titan River since then. I can't bring myself to go fishing anymore, or even step foot in the woods. The memory of those glowing eyes and that stretched, toothy grin haunts my dreams. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of that copper smell. And I know Somewhere out there in the darkness, that creature is still waiting, watching, hungry. I don't know if anyone will believe my story. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself most days. But I know what I experienced that night was real. And I'll never forget the terror of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. To anyone reading this, be careful out there in the wilderness. There are things lurking in the shadows that defy explanation. Things that have existed long before us and will continue to exist long after we're gone. And if you ever smell copper and rot while you're alone in the forest, run, and don't look back. I'm lucky to have escaped with my life that night. But the memory of that creature and the knowledge that it's still out there somewhere will haunt me for the rest of my days. The forests I once found so peaceful now fill me with dread. Every shadow holds the potential for those glowing eyes to appear again. I've tried to research similar encounters, hoping to find some explanation for what I saw. But nothing comes close to describing the horror of that night. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that low, guttural growl outside my window. I know I should probably seek help, talk to someone about what happened. But who would believe me? They'd say it was just stress, or that I imagined it all. But I know what I saw, I know what I smelled, and I know that somewhere out there, that creature is still hunting. To this day, I can't explain why it didn't kill me when it had the chance. Was it toying with me? Or did the flare truly drive it away? These questions keep me up at night, along with the fear that one day it might come to finish what it started. I'm sharing this story as a warning. Be vigilant when you're in the wilderness. Trust your instincts. And if you ever find yourself alone in the forest at night and the world goes eerily quiet, don't ignore it like I did. Get out of there as fast as you can, because there are things out there in the darkness, things that hunger, things that hunt. And once they've set their sights on you, they won't easily let go. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night by the Titan River. The fear has become a part of me now, as real and tangible as my own shadow. But by sharing my story, I hope that maybe, just maybe, someone else might be spared the terror I experienced. So please, be safe out there, and remember, if you smell copper and death on the wind, run. Run like your life depends on it, because it just might. As I walked out of the school building, I felt an immediate chill run down my spine. The street lamps cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the short walk home, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. About halfway there, I heard something that made me freeze in my tracks. A voice, barely above a whisper, seemed to be mimicking my footsteps from somewhere behind me. Step, 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 it rasped in time with my feet hitting the pavement. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened. "Is anyone there?" "Is anyone there?" the voice echoed back, but distorted and wrong somehow. I broke into a run then, no longer caring if I looked foolish. The voice kept pace, growing louder. "Run! Run! Run!" it mocked as I sprinted down the darkened street. When I finally reached my house, I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands. As I went to unlock the door, movement in the front garden caught my eye. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice. There, half hidden behind a tree, was something. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall and thin. Its skin was a sickly grayish-white that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But it was the face that truly terrified me, smooth and featureless except for two gaping black holes where the eyes should have been. As I stared in horror, it slowly raised one impossibly long, spindly arm and pointed directly at me with fingers like claws. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, my mum was opening the door and asking what was wrong. I pushed past her into the house, babbling incoherently about the thing in the garden. But when we looked outside, there was nothing there. My parents tried to calm me down, suggesting I'd just had a fright from shadows in the dark. But I knew what I'd seen. I was shaken to my core, unable to sleep that night as I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The next day at school, I confided in my best mate, Jack. He could see how freaked out I still was and offered to let me stay at his place that night if I was scared to go home. I gratefully accepted. As we walked to Jack's house that evening, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that pale figure lurking in the shadows. But the streets were quiet and normal. We hung out, played video games, and I started to relax a bit. Maybe it had just been my imagination running wild after all. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Jack's parents were out of town, so I was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, a faint scratching sound coming from the window. My heart began to race as I slowly turned my head towards the sound. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see a sliver of the back garden, dimly lit by moonlight. And there, pressed against the glass, were long, pale fingers with claw-like nails. I lay there paralyzed with fear, barely daring to breathe. The scratching continued, growing more insistent. Then a face began to emerge from the shadows, that same smooth, eyeless visage that had haunted me the night before. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and I heard that same rasping voice. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." I don't know how long I lay there, rigid with terror, before I finally found the strength to move. I scrambled off the sofa and raced upstairs to Jack's room, slamming and locking the door behind me. Jack woke up, alarmed by my panic. Between gasping breaths, I tried to explain what I'd seen. He grabbed a cricket bat from his closet, and we crept back downstairs together. But when we looked out the window, the garden was empty. We searched the whole house, but found no sign of an intruder. Jack was skeptical, gently suggesting that maybe I'd had a vivid nightmare brought on by stress. I wanted to believe him, but I knew deep down that it had been real. The next morning, we went outside to check around the house. That's when we found them. Long, deep scratches in the wood of the windowsill, right where I'd seen those horrible fingers. Jack's eyes went wide as he traced the marks with his fingers. "What the hell could have done this?" he muttered. I just shook my head, that familiar cold dread settling in my stomach. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was after me. In the weeks that followed, I was constantly on edge. I'd catch glimpses of pale movement out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. That rasping voice would sometimes whisper on the wind, mimicking my words or the sounds around me. I tried to research what it could be, spending hours online reading about folklore and paranormal encounters. Nothing quite fit, though some accounts of creatures called fleshgates or skinwalkers shared similarities. My schoolwork suffered as I grew more sleep-deprived and anxious. My parents and teachers were concerned, urging me to see a therapist. But how could I explain what was happening without sounding completely mad? The encounters grew bolder. One night, I woke to find long, pale fingers reaching through my partially open bedroom window. Another time, I glimpsed that eyeless face peering in at me through a second-story window at school. It all came to a head about a month after that first night. I was walking home from Jack's house, hurrying as the sun began to set. As I rounded a corner onto my street, I saw it standing there in the middle of the road. Its impossibly tall, thin form swayed slightly in the breeze. Those long arms hung at its sides, fingers nearly brushing the ground, and its face, God, that horrible blank face, was turned directly towards me. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then it began to move towards me with a jerky, unnatural gait. I turned and ran, no destination in mind beyond away. I could hear it behind me, that mocking voice calling out, "Run, run, run," in time with my footsteps. I don't know how long I ran or how far. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally slowed and looked back, the street behind me was empty. Shaken and exhausted, I made my way home. My parents were frantic, as I'd apparently been gone for hours with no word. I broke down then, finally telling them everything that had been happening. To my immense relief, they believed me. We packed up that very night and went to stay with my grandparents in Scotland. I kept expecting the creature to follow us, but the encounters just stopped. It's been 3 months now with no sign of it. I'm trying to move on with my life, but I still have nightmares sometimes. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there somewhere, waiting. I don't know what it wanted or why it fixated on me. Part of me hopes I never find out. I'm sharing this now in hopes that someone out there might have experienced something similar or have some insight into what this thing could be. And as a warning, if you ever hear a voice mimicking you in the dark, run. Don't look back. Just run. Still remember that day like it was yesterday. The events that unfolded in Dead Man's Gulch haunt me to this day, and I've never been able to fully explain or understand what happened out there in those remote Colorado mountains. I was working as a telecommunications technician at the time, servicing relay stations in some pretty isolated areas. When I got the assignment to head out to Dead Man's Gulch to repair a malfunctioning station, I didn't think much of it. Just another routine job in the middle of nowhere. Man, how wrong I was. The drive out there was long and lonely. As I wound my way up into the mountains, the scenery got more and more desolate. By the time I reached the turnoff for Dead Man's Gulch, I hadn't seen another vehicle or sign of civilization for hours. The narrow dirt road snaked its way deeper into a heavily forested valley, the towering pines pressing in on both sides. I kept checking my GPS, worried I'd taken a wrong turn, but eventually I saw the relay tower come into view on a ridge above me. I parked my work truck at the base of the access road and grabbed my tools. As soon as I stepped out, I was struck by how utterly silent it was. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that immediately put me on edge. Shaking off my unease, I started the hike up to the tower. About halfway there, movement caught my eye, and I froze. There, clear as day in a muddy patch, was a set of small footprints. They looked like a child's bare feet. My mind raced. What the hell would a kid be doing way out here? I looked around, called out, but got no response. The prints seemed to lead off into the woods before disappearing. Thoroughly creeped out now, I hurried the rest of the way to the tower. I tried to focus on the job at hand, running diagnostics and replacing some fried components, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Every few minutes I'd whip around, sure I'd heard something, but there was never anything there. After about an hour, I'd fixed the issue, and was packing up my gear when I heard what sounded like a child laughing. It was faint, but unmistakable. I called out again, but got no answer. Just as I was about to head down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My truck, which I'd left at the bottom of the hill, was now parked right at the base of the tower. There's no way anyone else could have driven it up that narrow, winding road without me noticing, and I certainly hadn't moved it myself. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. The keys were still in my pocket. I did a quick search of the cab and bed, half expecting to find someone hiding, but it was empty. What the actual fuck was going on? I decided I needed to get the hell out of there. I jumped in the truck and tried to start it, but the engine just clicked. Dead battery. How was that possible? It had been running fine earlier. I popped the hood to check the connections, and that's when I heard it, a soft giggle right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. There was no one there, but in the dirt, leading away from the truck, was a fresh set of those small footprints. I slammed the hood shut and frantically tried the ignition again. This time it roared to life. I threw it in reverse and got the hell out of there, fishtailing down the access road. As I sped back towards the main highway, my radio suddenly crackled to life. Through the static, I could make out what sounded like a child's voice, sing-songing, "Come play with me." I nearly drove off the road. I jabbed at the power button, but it wouldn't shut off. The voice kept repeating that phrase, growing louder and more distorted. Other voices started to join in, overlapping and echoing. My head was pounding. I could barely see straight. Just as I thought I was going to lose control, I burst out of the tree line onto the main road. Instantly, the cacophony cut out. I didn't slow down until I hit the first town, about 40 miles away. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold my coffee as I tried to calm down in a diner. I debated whether to call the police, but what would I even say? I had no proof of anything, just a wild story that made me sound insane. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop researching the area, trying to make sense of what happened. That's when I came across an article from a few years back about another tech who'd gone missing in Dead Man's Gulch. They'd found his truck abandoned by the tower, but no trace of him was ever found. I quit my job the next day and moved out of state shortly after. I've never gone back to Colorado, and I sure as hell have never set foot in those mountains again. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced. Was it some twisted hillbilly messing with me? A ghost? Something worse? I don't know, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that there's something out there in Dead Man's Gulch, something that doesn't want to be found. And if you value your sanity, you'll stay the hell away from that place. I wish I had. It was supposed to be a routine 5-day trek, just me and 4 friends who wanted to experience the rugged beauty of the mountains. We'd done similar trips before, so I wasn't worried. The first couple days were great. Clear skies, breathtaking views, that crisp mountain air that just invigorates you. We were making good time and spirits were high. But on the 3rd day, things started to feel off. I noticed it first when we stopped for a water break near a small stream. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds chirping, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just complete silence. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was probably just the wind carrying sound away from us, but I couldn't quite convince myself. As we continued hiking that afternoon, I started noticing other odd things. Broken branches way too high up on trees for any normal animal to reach, and then the footprints. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There, in a muddy patch, were enormous humanoid footprints. They had to be at least 18 inches long. My stomach dropped as I stared at them, trying to come up with a rational explanation. I didn't want to alarm the others, so I said nothing. But that night around the campfire, everyone seemed on edge. Conversations were muted, and people kept glancing nervously into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. I tried to keep things upbeat, but inside, I was starting to seriously worry about what we might be dealing with out here. The fourth day is when things really went to hell. We'd been hiking for a couple hours when suddenly Mike, who was bringing up the rear, let out a strangled yell. We all whipped around to see him pointing shakily off to our right, and there, partially obscured by trees about 50 yards away, was something. My brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing at first. It was huge, easily 9 feet tall, and covered in dark, shaggy hair. For a split second it just stood there, staring at us with unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Then it let out a roar that shook me to my core and charged. I'm not ashamed to admit that I panicked. "Run!" I screamed, and we all took off sprinting down the trail. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind us, gaining ground with each massive stride. The obvious human intelligence behind its movements was terrifying. This was no ordinary animal. We ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. My lungs were on fire and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. Finally, we burst out of the tree line into a small clearing, and I risked a glance back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the forest, pacing back and forth and letting out occasional grunts and howls. It clearly didn't want to leave the cover of the trees. We took the opportunity to catch our breath and try to process what the hell was happening. "What was that thing?" Lisa kept asking, her voice shaking. "Bigfoot? Are we being chased by fucking Bigfoot?" I didn't have any answers. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never seen anything like it. Sure, I'd heard the legends and campfire stories, but I'd always written them off as nonsense. Now I wasn't so sure. We decided to make camp right there in the clearing, hoping the open space would give us some protection. Nobody slept that night. We huddled around the fire, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. I kept my rifle close, though I doubted it would do much good against that monster if it decided to attack. The next morning, we broke camp at first light and practically ran down the mountain. I've never moved so fast on a descent in my life. We didn't stop to rest or eat, just pushed on with single-minded determination to get the hell out of there. When we finally reached the trailhead and piled into our cars, the relief was overwhelming. We were safe. We'd made it out. But as I drove home, the reality of what we'd experienced started to sink in. This wasn't something I could just forget or explain away. That creature was real, and it was out there in the mountains I'd thought I knew so well. I haven't led another expedition since that trip. I can't bring myself to go back into those woods, knowing what might be lurking in the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress and isolation played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the fear in my friend's eyes, the undeniable physical evidence we saw, and I know it was real. I don't know what that thing was or why it seemed so determined to drive us out of its territory. But I do know that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's better to leave them undisturbed. I just hope that by sharing my story, I can warn others to be careful. The mountains hold secrets, and not all of them should be uncovered. I've been working the night shift as a police officer in this small town for over a decade. Nothing much ever happens here. mostly just rowdy teenagers or the occasional drunk driver. But that night changed everything. It was a typically quiet Thursday evening in late October. The air was crisp, and a harvest moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the tombstones as I made my routine drive through Cypress Hill. I'd done this route hundreds of times before, but something felt off that night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly cruised down the winding cemetery road. About halfway through my patrol, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But then I saw it clearly, a large, dark shape moving between the gravestones. My first thought was that it must be a bear. We get them wandering into town occasionally, though I'd never seen one in the cemetery before. I slowed the patrol car to a crawl and flipped on the spotlight. What I saw next made my blood run cold. It wasn't a bear, at least not like any bear I'd ever seen. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. But that's where any resemblance to a normal bear ended. Its neck was unnaturally long and seemed to sway slightly, like a snake. The fur was patchy and sickly pale, almost translucent in the harsh glare of the spotlight. But it was the face that truly haunted me. The muzzle was too long, filled with jagged teeth that didn't quite fit in its mouth. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They were huge, bulging orbs of solid black that reflected no light. Soulless pits that seemed to stare right through me. I sat there frozen in shock for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The creature was hunched over a grave, massive claws tearing into the earth. Its head snapped towards me with unsettling speed when the spotlight hit it. Those dead eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. My training kicked in, and I fumbled for the radio, calling for backup. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monstrosity before me. As I was calling it in, the creature's mouth opened impossibly wide in what I can only describe as a grin. Then it started moving towards my car. It didn't run or lope like a normal animal. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like someone doing a crude stop-motion animation. But it covered ground with terrifying speed. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed up the narrow cemetery road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept my eyes locked on the creature the whole time, watching in horror as it rapidly closed the distance. Just as it was about to reach the car, I whipped the wheel around and floored it. I tore out of that cemetery like a bat out of hell, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was a few miles away. When backup arrived, they found me pulled over on the side of the road, shaking and barely able to form coherent sentences. I managed to tell them what I'd seen, though I could tell they didn't believe me. They assumed I'd dozed off and had a vivid nightmare. But the next morning, everything changed. Reports came in of a grave that had been dug up overnight at Cypress Hill. When the groundskeeper investigated, he found a 6-foot deep hole where a fresh burial had been just days before. The coffin lid had been ripped off its hinges, and the body was missing. The official report blamed it on grave robbers, but I know the truth. Those claw marks were unmistakable. Whatever that thing was, it had been real, and it had taken that body for God knows what purpose. In the months since, I've done every bit of research I could on the history of Cypress Hill and local folklore. I've found whispered stories of an old Algonquin curse and sightings of strange creatures dating back centuries, but nothing concrete. I requested a transfer to day shifts after that night. I can't bring myself to patrol the cemetery anymore. Sometimes when I drive past, I swear I catch a glimpse of pale fur and black eyes watching from the shadows. but I tell myself it's just my imagination. I don't know if that creature is still out there, or if I'll ever truly understand what I saw that night. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never look at the darkness the same way again, and I pray I never again encounter the thing I've come to think of as the graveyard bear. It was supposed to be a routine job, just another geotechnical survey in the mountains. I'd been working as a drilling engineer for almost a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that day. Our team of 5 arrived at the remote site early that morning. It was a crisp autumn day, and the mountains loomed ominously around us as we set up our equipment. The job seemed straightforward enough: drill some test bores to assess the geological composition for a potential mining operation. As we started drilling the first hole, everything seemed normal. The familiar rumble of the rig, the rhythmic clanking of metal on rock. But about 50 feet down, something changed. The drill bit suddenly lurched, as if it had broken through into a cavern. And then the most god-awful smell hit us, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. "What the hell is that?" shouted Mike, our senior engineer. He motioned for us to cut the engine. As the noise died down, we gathered around the borehole, peering down into the darkness. At first, all I could see was an inky blackness, but then something started oozing up from the depths. A thick, dark red liquid, almost the consistency of blood. "Jesus Christ," whispered Anna, our geologist. She bent down to get a closer look. "I've never seen anything like this before." The liquid kept rising, faster now, bubbling up from the hole like some kind of hellish fountain. The stench was overwhelming. I felt my stomach lurch and had to step back, fighting the urge to vomit. "We need to take a sample," Mike said, his face pale. "Anna, can you—" But before he could finish, the ground began to tremble beneath our feet. At first, I thought it was just the vibrations from our equipment, but this was different. A deep, pulsing sensation that seemed to be coming from far below the earth. And then we heard it. A sound I'll never forget as long as I live. A low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very rock itself. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tremors intensified, and cracks started appearing in the ground around the borehole. The red liquid was gushing out now, pooling around our feet. And then, God, I can barely bring myself to describe what happened next. Something started emerging from the hole. At first, I thought it was just more of the liquid, but this was different. It was moving, pulsing, alive. A mass of writhing, fleshy tendrils began to force its way up through the opening. It was reddish-brown and glistening, covered in a slimy sheen. As it emerged, it seemed to be reaching out, probing the air around it. I stood there frozen in horror, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This thing, whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't of this world. Anna was the first to break the spell. She let out a blood-curdling scream and stumbled backward, tripping over some equipment. That snapped the rest of us out of our trance. "Run!" Mike yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Everyone get to the trucks, now!" We didn't need to be told twice. We ran like hell, slipping and sliding in the red muck that now covered the ground. I could hear that unearthly moaning getting louder behind us, feel the ground shaking more violently with each step. I risked a glance over my shoulder as I ran. The thing was pulling itself further out of the hole. It was massive now, easily the size of a car and still growing. Tendrils were lashing out in all directions, grabbing onto rocks and trees, pulling itself forward. We piled into the trucks, engines roaring to life. As we peeled out of there, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The entire drilling site was now engulfed in a writhing mass of flesh, and rising above it all was what looked like, oh God, it looked like a face, a vast, inhuman face emerging from the earth itself. The drive back to civilization was a blur. We were all in shock, barely speaking except to confirm that yes, that had really happened. None of us could make sense of what we'd seen. When we got back to headquarters and reported what had happened, I expected alarm, calls to the authorities, a team sent to investigate. Instead, we were met with cold, calculated responses. Our boss listened to our frantic recounting with an impassive expression. When we finished, he simply said, "I understand you've had a stressful day. Why don't you all take some time off to recover?" We protested, insisted that something needed to be done, but it quickly became clear that they had no intention of pursuing this. We were told in no uncertain terms to forget what we'd seen, that it was clearly some kind of mass hallucination brought on by gas leaking from the borehole. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. That thing was real, and it's still out there, deep in the Montana wilderness. In the weeks that followed, I tried to find out more. I discreetly reached out to locals, asked if there had been any strange sightings or unexplained events in the area. Most just gave me odd looks, but a few got a haunted look in their eyes. They'd mutter something about the mountains being alive, about the earth having secrets best left buried. I couldn't let it go. I pored over geological surveys, folklore, anything I could get my hands on, and I started to find hints. Nothing concrete, but whispers. Stories of strange lights in the mountains, of people going missing, of odd tremors that didn't match any known fault lines. But every time I tried to dig deeper, I'd hit a wall. Files would be missing or redacted. People would suddenly become unavailable or claim they'd never spoken to me. It was clear that someone, somewhere, was working very hard to keep this quiet. I don't work for that company anymore. I couldn't stomach it, knowing what I knew. But I can't escape the memory of that day. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm back there. I feel the ground shaking beneath my feet. I smell that awful rotting stench, and I see that face rising from the earth, ancient and alien and hungry. I don't know what that thing was. Some kind of underground creature? An ancient spirit? Or something else entirely, something our science can't yet comprehend? All I know is that it was alive, it was vast, and it was awakening. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can feel the ground trembling ever so slightly beneath my feet, and I wonder, is it still down there, deep in the earth? Is it growing, spreading? And what will happen when it finally decides to fully emerge? I don't have any answers, but I know what I saw that day in Montana, and I know that there are things in this world, in the very ground beneath our feet, that are far stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you feel the earth shake just a little, remember my story and wonder what might be stirring in the depths below. It was supposed to be a routine patrol flight over the western section of the forest. The weather was clear that day, with just a few scattered clouds, perfect conditions for flying. I took off from our base around 9 a.m., climbing to about 1,000 feet as I headed west over the dense canopy of evergreens. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. I was cruising along, keeping an eye out for any signs of smoke or disturbances in the forest below. The sea of green stretched out as far as I could see in every direction. It was peaceful up there, just me and the steady thrum of the rotors. Around 10:30, I banked the chopper to circle back east. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was something massive moving through the treetops about half a mile ahead. I blinked hard and looked again, thinking it must be a shadow from a cloud. But as I got closer, I realized with growing horror that this was no trick of the light. Straddling the canopy was the largest spider I've ever seen, and I mean largest by an insane degree. This thing was the size of a house, maybe bigger. Its body alone must have been 30 feet long, with legs stretching out another 50 feet on each side. The thing was pitch black, with a glossy exoskeleton that gleamed in the sunlight. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My hands were shaking on the controls as I watched this monstrosity delicately pick its way across the treetops. Its movements were unnaturally graceful for something so huge. Each step was carefully placed as it navigated from one towering pine to the next. Part of me wanted to radio it in immediately, but who would believe me? I needed to get closer, to make absolutely sure I wasn't hallucinating. I steered the chopper in a wide arc, approaching from the side to get a better view. As I got within about 1,000 feet, the creature suddenly stopped moving. I swear it turned its head, if you can call it a head, and looked right at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Those eyes. There were way too many of them, glittering like black marbles all across its face. I got the distinct impression it was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the rotor blades. Then, faster than something that size should be able to move, it skittered sideways and vanished into the canopy. The trees shook violently in its wake, but within moments there was no sign it had ever been there. I hovered in place for a good 5 minutes, scanning the forest below for any further movement. But there was nothing, just miles of trees swaying gently in the breeze. Finally, my training kicked in, and I radioed back to base, requesting an immediate return due to equipment issues. There was no way I could continue the patrol after what I'd just seen. I spent the entire flight back in a daze, trying to process what had happened. Had I really seen that thing? Was I going crazy? I've spent countless hours flying over these forests, and I've never seen anything even remotely like that before. When I got back to base, I seriously debated whether to report what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I'd sound like a lunatic. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. I needed time to think, to try and make sense of it all. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gleaming black legs moving through the trees. I kept wondering, where did it come from? How long has it been out there? Are there more of them? The next day at work, I was a nervous wreck. I kept expecting someone to confront me, to say they'd picked up something strange on radar. But nobody said anything out of the ordinary. I went through the motions of my daily routine, all the while watching my co-workers and wondering if any of them had seen something similar. It wasn't until 3 days later that I got up the courage to confide in someone. Jake, another pilot I've known for years, caught me alone in the break room. He must have noticed how on edge I'd been, because he asked if everything was all right. Before I knew it, the whole story came spilling out. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, but as I talked, I saw his face go pale. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. I've seen it too. Jake told me that about 6 months ago, he'd spotted something similar while on a night patrol. He'd written it off as exhaustion, convinced himself it was just shadows playing tricks on him in the darkness. But hearing my story brought it all back. We spent the next hour comparing notes, describing every detail we could remember. The size, the movement, the unnatural grace, it all matched up. Knowing I wasn't alone, that someone else had seen this thing, was both a relief and terrifying. It meant I wasn't going crazy, but it also meant that this creature, whatever it was real. Since then, Jake and I have been discreetly asking around, trying to see if anyone else has spotted anything unusual. So far, we haven't found any other witnesses. We've debated reporting it officially, but without any evidence beyond our word. We're afraid of not being taken seriously, or worse, being grounded for psychological evaluation. So for now, we're keeping our eyes open and watching the forests closely on every flight. I don't know what that thing is or where it came from. All I know is that it's out there, hidden in the vast wilderness of Olympic National Forest. And every time I take off, I can't help but wonder, will today be the day I see it again? I'm sharing this story now because I can't shake the feeling that something big is coming. That creature is still out there, and sooner or later, someone else is going to see it. When that happens, I want there to be a record of what Jake and I saw. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, please reach out. We need to know we're not alone in this. And if you find yourself in Olympic National Forest, keep your eyes on the trees. You never know what might be watching you from above.